This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
It is 3 minutes after 10, and I'll start with a comment from Adam in Derby, which arrived just as I sat down a moment ago. Morning, James. I don't think I have ever been so ashamed to be British, knowing that those thugs over the weekend felt supported by our government and the Home Secretary leaves my blood running cold. And to hear people saying that the woke left have won again because she has been sacked just makes me despair. I don't think there'll be many people saying that, but of course the people that are will claim they're part of the silent majority, even as they shout their unhinged bile from the very rooftops. Do you want to know something funny? Do you want to know what David Cameron was reported by The Sun? I grant you, not the most reliable organ necessarily, but they've usually got a fairly direct line to senior Tories, of course. The Sun reported in November of 2018, so just 5 short years ago. And there's a word in this headline I can't repeat on the radio. I've just been told. I would argue that Ofcom would give me a break on this because it is reportage, it is live and relevant news, but I have been ordered. No, okay, I'm just not going to do it. Relax, all right? I still think I should. And we haven't had time to set a bleep up, have we, either? No. Okay. So under the headline, Cam again, get it? David Cameron tells friends he is planning a return to frontline politics as next Foreign Secretary because he is bored less. So you can work out what was in the middle of that word. Okay, that was nicely done. I felt very nicely done. So there it is. I mean, that's the state of British politics. David Cameron delivers the country into utterly avoidable decline because he was frightened of all the racists that were attracted to Nigel Farage's party. Fails to fight a decent campaign in order to stop the madness of becoming the first population in history to vote to impose economic sanctions on itself, leaves the door wide open, despite Theresa May's best efforts to keep the madness at bay, for absolutely unsuitable characters like Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings to storm into Downing Street, the inevitable disaster that followed, leaving the door open for an arguably even bigger disaster called Liz Truss, and then up pops Rishi Sunak to reappoint the most disgusting holder of high office that this country has arguably ever seen, in the person of Suella Braverman, sacked now in just over a year from the same job twice. And what happens? David Cameron comes back as Foreign Secretary because, in his own words, according to the newspaper whose boss at the time wrote to David Cameron saying, I can't wait to start working together, the newspaper that has a fairly direct line to David Cameron reports that he wants to become back as Foreign Secretary because he's bored less. And that's Britain. If only someone had written a book about how it got so badly broken. Oh, they have. And it's currently number 4 in the Sunday Times non-fiction bestseller chart. So thank you very much for that. And I am going to mention it this morning, not to boast anymore. I've got the boasting out of the way, because I do 2 things in my new book, How They Broke Britain. I use Suella Braverman and Dominic Raab as examples of how supremely unfit candidates can rise to the highest office in the land in this country now, despite the fact that anybody paying attention knows that they are guaranteed to depart in disgrace. How did I know that? Well, Raab already has. And Braverman has already departed in disgrace once. I didn't foresee, I grant you, that she'd probably depart in disgrace twice in the week that the book came out. There's also a chapter on David Cameron, which explains how his arrogance, complacency and sense of entitlement combined to create somebody who thought that he could undo the unravelable knot of the Conservative Party and Europe just by using his supposed charm and his self-identified attributes and skills. But of course he operates in a system where nobody ever turns around and says to him, I think a very, very long period of silence from you, Mr. Cameron, might be for the best. He sits there, blathering around in his caravan, writing his ludicrous memoirs, his exculpatory memoirs, trying to do deals on behalf of companies during the PPE crisis, and now pops up as Foreign Secretary. Because why wouldn't he? Why? Just because I've presided over utter disaster. Look at the pivot point in UK politics that David Cameron represents. All right, so it goes Major, Blair, Brown. Statesmen all, right? You might not like them, but you can't argue with the fact that when they stood next to other world leaders on the world stage, we didn't look ridiculous. And then Cameron comes in. Think of him as the fulcrum. That's the right word, isn't it? I remember it from GCSE physics. The sort of triangular-shaped thing upon which a seesaw sits. So Cameron is the fulcrum. So you go Major. Well, in fact, she's no longer with us, which is why she wasn't in the photographs at the weekend, but you can easily extend to Thatcher as well. So Thatcher, Major, Blair, Brown, right? Then along comes Davy Cameron. And what do we get after that? May, okay, a holding pattern perhaps, but still pretty disastrous by most obvious measures. May, Johnson, Truss, Sunak. Look at that. That's Britain. That's David Cameron's role in British democracy. To take a country that had seen Margaret Thatcher, John Major, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown govern and turn it into a country where Boris Johnson, Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak can, in the space of 18 months, all hold the highest office in the land. And you think it's an exaggeration sometimes to describe the scale of the decline over which we have surveilled. So what are we going to do? What are we going to do this morning? I think we'll look first at Suella Braverman, and we'll look at the frankly astonishing gamble that she took with our country's security this weekend by siding with far-right thugs against the Metropolitan Police. She, and this is my analysis, which you are welcome to question, challenge, or completely reject. You're also free, of course, to agree with it. She wanted a race riot. She wanted to see serious violence between far-right thugs and Palestinian protesters. I will mention relatively frequently that some of the banners and some of the chants that were being carried and shouted by some of the Palestinian marchers were utterly despicable. Some of them, I think, breach the threshold for criminal activity, but they are not our concern this morning, because the 300,000 people and every media organisation in the country desperately looking for the malfeasance in that crowd, we've got a fairly clear idea of how much there was. So you're talking about 300,000 people having their cause polluted by the actions of some absolutely despicable people. When it comes to the far-right thugs who turned up after Suella Braverman blew her whistle, you're talking about 100% scumbags. There is no argument there that some very decent people who turned up to ... had their cause hijacked by scumbags. 300,000 marchers had their cause hijacked by a few scumbags. But the far-right protesters dancing to Suella Braverman's tune were scumbags to a man, every single one of them. And she wanted a lot more to turn up. She was hoping that there would be hundreds, if not thousands of people descending upon our capital city looking for a scrap. Even little Tommy Ten Names jumped in a pride taxi after realising that the numbers that were needed for the sort of disruption and violence they dreamt of were simply not going to materialise. But the Home Secretary did their best to make sure that they would. She did their best to call, and some members of the media did as well. It's time to take a stand. It's time that patriots stood up for their country. Fascistic language, deliberately fascistic language, inciting violence. But in a country where the newspaper culture and right-wing media is so completely dominant that nobody's going to call it out. Yesterday, do you know what the Mail on Sunday had as their main story? How many police were injured on Saturday? I've got 9 in the back of my mind somewhere. 9 police injured, possibly more. And do you know what the Mail on Sunday went with? Michael Gove got jostled at a railway station. That's the country we've created now. Somebody somewhere sits in a newspaper office deciding what the major story, the major issue of moment, after a narrowly averted race riot called by the actual Home Secretary after attacking and alienating the Metropolitan Police Service, and saw them attacked by the far-right thugs who were dancing to her tune, and somebody sat in a newspaper office and decided that the big story of the moment, I think his name is David Dillon, the editor of the Mail on Sunday, somebody sat in a newspaper office and decided that the big story of the moment was Michael Gove getting jostled at Victoria Station. Oh, forgive me, he was also abused. God forbid, the poor man. Honestly, I hope he had a nice lie down after that. Someone sat there and thought, never mind about the police being attacked, never mind about the narrowly averted race riot, never mind about the appalling far-right screaming and attacks on our streets. Let's focus on Michael Gove being jostled at a railway station that he'd presumably chose to visit after eschewing the services of his ministerial chauffeur. The mind boggles. But we are where we are. So the argument put forward yesterday by a couple of politicians, and they did so very, 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 very reluctantly, trying to pretend that Suella Braverman had not caused the near crisis that we saw on our streets yesterday, was an exercise in reality denial that made almost made campaigning for Brexit look rational. Simply denying the relationship between cause and effect. The Home Secretary comes out, calls peaceful protests hate marches, and then attacks the police charged with trying to keep the peace. And a few, thankfully, a small number of knuckle-dragging hooligans turned up looking for a fight. She tried to reignite the Islamophobia that has corrupted much of our society for the last few. She's tried desperately to get the Islamophobia up and running once again. And in some ways, she has succeeded in terms of the conversation, the rhetoric and the coverage. But the massive, massive majority of people marching this weekend resisted any temptation, if indeed there was, to meet hate with hate, to actually deliver the riot that they dreamt of. You remember that the Daily Mail actually, you might think I'm exaggerating. My curse is that I have to pay attention to this stuff more than is healthy. The Daily Mail actually carried the headline, "Pray there is not a riot at the Cenotaph," when they were clearly praying that there would be. Just as Suella Braverman was desperately hoping for way more violence than we saw this weekend. I'll tell you, and I don't do this very often, particularly in recent years, thank God for the Metropolitan Police. Mark Rowley not only standing up to a morally corrupt and deeply dangerous Home Secretary, insisting on the sustaining of policing by consent, recognising what his role is and refusing to become a political tool for the fevered ambitions of the ridiculous Home Secretary, but also somehow managing to deliver to his men and women, to his force, the confidence that they policed with his full support as they sought to keep the peace that the Home Secretary herself desperately wanted to see breached. Think about that, please, for a minute. The Home Secretary wanted a riot. Editors of national newspapers, columnists and commentators desperately wanted pray there is not a riot at the Cenotaph, they wrote, while licking their lips at the prospect. Because the Conservative Party in its current iteration is so completely broken, and the country has been so completely screwed by almost a decade and a half of their incompetence and arrogance, that the only chance they've got of hanging on to any vestiges of power is by creating a country so febrile and so hate-filled and so divided that they might just be able to ride the crest of a culture war wave to some sort of narrow victory in an election where Suella Braverman would have been the leader of the Tory party. So do not let anybody dissuade you from the full understanding of how awful everything is and how close we came to a major catastrophe. Well, people in my profession either sort of mildly cheered it on, loudly cheered it on, or sat on their hands, or still, because they're the same people that brought you Brexit, that brought you David Cameron, that brought you Boris Johnson, that brought you Liz Truss, that brought you Rishi Sunak. They still don't understand what they're talking about, but they get paid fat chunks of money to write articles and make pronouncements designed to convey the idea that they understand what's going on in this country. You understand what's going on in this country. And what is going on in this country is the sight this weekend of a Home Secretary trying to incite a race riot. And thank God she failed. 0345 60 60 973 is the number you need. It's a little bit arrogant of me to suggest that we should dedicate the first hour of the programme exclusively to analysing my own reading of the situation yesterday, but I'll broaden it out. What happened this weekend? 0345 60 60 973, and I'm referring specifically to three things. Number one, the police today are certain that the attacks upon them were in many ways spawned, incited, caused by the words of the Home Secretary. How have we ended up in a country where people who go to work every morning knowing that that could be their last day on this planet, I know that applies to all of us, but you understand the pertinence of that point when we're talking about police. You wave goodbye to your policewoman wife or your policeman husband or your policeman dad, and you know they could die in the line of duty. And today we live in a country where they are adamant that the people who violently attacked them on Saturday were doing the Home Secretary's bidding. They were responding to the Home Secretary's rhetoric. I think for today at least, I'm not going to let you call them liars. Largely because they're not, and also because of the risks they take on all of our behalves. So how did that happen? How did we end up in a place where a Home Secretary can effectively seek to incite a race riot, where the police feel that the people attacking them are doing the bidding of one of the holders of the great offices of state? Actually, that's the question, isn't it? I've given you the what of it. I've told you what happened. I want you to tell me why. Why did this happen? Why did Suella Braverman attack the police and summon a mob of far-right hooligans to pollute our capital city on a day of remembrance, while 300,000 overwhelmingly peaceful people sought to call for an armistice on the day that we commemorate what is for British people the most resonant armistice of all? How did that happen? And crucially, I think, how did we let it happen? It's 10:19.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
22 minutes after 10. We'll see how things unspool today. Some days I just think we're hanging out. I nearly said chilling then, chilling together, but no, that wouldn't be appropriate really. We're just hanging out together, having a chat about what's happening in real time. So do ring in from whatever angle you please. I'm minded at the moment to talk a little later about what David Cameron's resurrection tells us about the state of the country, although I may reserve the right to answer that question myself. But I don't want Suella Braverman to depart in disguise, as it were. I don't want the absolutely appalling events of this weekend, caused inarguably and irrefutably by her. The more a right-wing commentator shouts or a right-wing politician shouts that it wasn't her fault, the louder they are, the more certain you can be that they know in their heart of hearts that it was absolutely her intention. And it failed largely because the peaceful protesters stayed peaceful, and the Metropolitan Police did their job in the most unfair and unacceptable of circumstances. And do you know what else is unfair and unacceptable? They're not allowed to talk to me. Serving police officers cannot ring programmes like this. Occasionally, a couple do, but the rules are pretty clear that they cannot ring a programme like this to talk about operational matters. So we will talk for them, and we will say that having a Home Secretary attack you verbally and then days later have far-right thugs attack you physically is like night following day, and most categorically not a coincidence. 24 after 10 is the time. Sarah is in Leicester. Sarah, what would you like to say?
Hi, good morning. Hi, good morning, Nick. Hi, how are you?
I'm
you
very
okay?
well, John.
John?
Nick?
Hello?
Hello?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I'm James.
Oh, is it James? Oh, sorry, I thought it was on. I've been waiting for a while.
That's all right. So you listened to that introduction there and you thought it was Nick Ferrari?
Yes, I did.
Well, that is, I'll tell you what, it takes all sorts, Sarah, doesn't it? But on we go.
Yeah, last time I mistook...
I mean, when I said the people that brought you, Brexit, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, David Cameron, they have got a lot to answer for, and they're not taking responsibility for any of their contributions to public discourse. Was that not a clue? Carry on anyway, don't worry. It's all right. It's the top of the show and you're nervous. What would you like to say?
I just wanted to talk a little bit about, the events over the weekend. I'm just really appalled that, it's taken this long for Rishi Sunak to actually, sack Suella Braverman. I'm just shocked at the events over the weekend. I think she made the police job a lot harder. I was there on Saturday, to be honest. And
you went, did you?
Yes, I did.
Can I ask you a question? Because I have seen this emerge a lot, and I think it is a pertinent question. It's not the most important, and it's not one that I will focus on unduly this morning. But do you think that peaceful marchers could have done more to call out some of the banners and some of the slogans that were blatantly obnoxious, anti-Semitic, and possibly criminal? I've seen a lot of people suggesting that people like you could have done more to address people like them.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, 100%, that's not on. That's something. And I think, majority of the 300,000 plus people that were there were not holding those banners. I think there's a couple of photos I've seen of a woman with a placard. And I think there's a couple of guys. And because they were covering their faces, you don't know who's behind that. So obviously, but majority of the people that I saw didn't have any sort of, placards like that. They were not there to cause hostility or hate. And I think what I really disagreed with, what Suella was trying to, entice the hatred amongst people, amongst the public. And, she's a leader at the end of the day, and people do listen to what she has to say. And, she should be a role model for everybody. But I think instead, what she did and what happened on Saturday morning in particular, I think that was... It
was entirely at her. And I suppose people who haven't got a problem with her, people claiming, as I heard, I did actually hear on Nick's show, some woman saying that it was a victory for the woke, whatever that means. They feel she was right to attack peaceful protesters. How much Islamophobia is in the room, do you think? How much of this is the unspoken hatred, the presumption that if you're marching for... I saw the march in Edinburgh. I wasn't in London at the weekend. I walked through the march in Edinburgh, and it would have been impossible, actually, to describe a sort of dominant ethnicity. A heck of a lot of white people there, a heck of a lot of people of Asian heritage. You'd have to guess at religion, but they're creating the idea in the minds of certainly little Tommy Ten Names and his supporters that this was some sort of Muslim march. The hatred that I saw being shouted at cameras by some of his supporters was we were born here and you're terrorists, that kind of thing. There's Islamophobia in the room. I wonder how much of that is down to Braverman.
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely down to her. I think, people do look at what politicians say, and I think her trying to control the police. We're not living in a corrupt country where, for example, some of the third world countries where the politicians do control the police, they control the judges. There's no law, there's no justice, and I think that's what she tried to do. She always stepped the mark. But in terms of me being there on Saturday, yes. I was actually there near the Senate House because I wanted to spend the whole weekend, taking part in different events. I'm one of those that don't believe in any type of war. But I did, because I had my kids with me, I did feel unsafe, to be honest, being near the Senate, especially when I saw, shouting. It was almost like being in a football match.
Well, it was exactly like that. And they were football hooligans, really, who've been sort of riled up and almost wound up like little clockwork toys and then sent off in the direction of people like you, of people on the march. It is coming up to 29 minutes after 10. Let's squeeze in one more before the news. Gerald is in Glasgow. What was she up to? What was the plan, Gerald? I still can't fully see it, except the rather grim conclusion that she wanted carnage on the streets of London on Saturday.
I think, if anything, carnage is a strong word, because I think as Home Secretary to actually actively desire death and physical violence is something that...
I don't know that I'd include death. I mean serious violence. Who knows where serious violence can lead? But
serious violence can lead to death accidentally.
Yes, of course it can.
If that had been the case, we'd be having an entirely different conversation today as well. I think she knew exactly what she was doing. And I think this is the actions of an entirely cynical, deeply disturbed individual. I don't think Suella Braverman thinks the same way other people think. She doesn't have a moral compass in the same way other people have a moral compass. She has shown time and time again through her rhetoric, things that she said openly, which for any other position, whether it be in government or just the guy who is behind the counter in the shop, if they just actively said these things in front of people, in front of customers, they would have been sacked earlier than this.
Yeah, well, obviously.
It's entirely geared towards a very, very poisonous vocal minority.
That's the thing, isn't it? Because again, we're almost in cock-up or conspiracy theory territory, aren't we? Is that you presume that she had some sort of master plan, or that she was just, rampaging around like a bull in a china shop. Or the third analysis, which is yours, and I don't think either of us are qualified to go much further with this, but the third analysis is some sort of psychological flaw, some deep psychological flaw that spares her the inconvenience of worrying about the impact of her actions. But even then, there'd have to be in her mind some idea of where these actions would lead, and apart from a profound hope that the scenes on Saturday had been much, much more violent and much, much more widespread and had involved the people protesting against the continuing bombardment of Gaza, I can't see what she actually wanted to happen at the weekend. What would have been a win for her?
I think to actually have footage of protesters and counter-protesters coming to fistfights.
I think you're right.
It's just all she wanted. It's a great deal to say Suella Braverman is some Machiavellian supervillain with a
it's just like Trump. It's just Trump on January the 6th. You just wanted it to kick off.
You just wanted it to kick off, because if it kicks off, then you can gaslight people, as she's already been doing, and saying, well, these are violent people. We had brave.
We need to clamp down on them harder.
Patriots, we had patriots coming along to the cenotaph to protect it. Protect the realm was the thing that came about at the weekend, and the violence came from those people. Yes, there have been arrests on the side of the protesters who were in favour of Palestine,
many.
And not many.
And they're looking for the police are looking.
They're looking for.
But the idea of actually attacking the police unprompted and unprovoked that's Suella Braverman's crowd. They are Braverman's boys.
Yeah, if the image had been on the nightly news of 300,000 people, I think more were there.
Yeah, London, most people are telling me that, but they always do.
However many people were there, but they always do.
Yeah.
However many people were there versus a tiny, quote-unquote, patriotic minority just standing up for Britishness or our rights or whatever it is that she would spin it into, that is exactly what she wanted, because it would justify and validate everything she said up to this point.
And weaponise the situation still further. That's the depressing bit of this analysis, is that, you strip it back to the why of it, and you think, because the Conservative government is such a lost cause now that the only way they could have a prayer of securing power at the next election would be if the country had been turned into some sort of cauldron. And I truly believe she tried to turn it into a cauldron this weekend. And if it had succeeded, I don't think Rishi Sunak would have sacked her. Think about that for a minute. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
10:37 is the time. I do, as the dust settles on David Cameron's appointment as Foreign Secretary, which presumably involves an immediate elevation to the House of Lords, I do find myself wondering whether that's more emblematic of the broader malaise than the recent disgrace of Suella Braverman. If you want to look at the national catastrophe that we're living through at the moment, and the idea that you would bring David Cameron back to one of the great offices of state, when in many ways he was responsible for starting our national decline, austerity, which some people still claim was a necessity of public finance, as opposed to an ideological belief that, well, Alexei Sayle put it best, that the global financial crisis of 2008 was caused by there being too many libraries in Wolverhampton, or perhaps too many Sure Start centres in Harlesden, or too many unemployed people being able to feed themselves without having to go to a food bank. Not even unemployed, too many people in jobs, too many young families being able to feed themselves without resort to a food bank. That and of course the people who defended austerity are the people that told you Brexit would be brilliant, the people who told you that Boris Johnson would be a great Prime Minister, the people who claimed that Liz Truss's budget was a work of fiscal genius, and the people who claimed that Rishi Sunak would somehow prompt a return to professionalism, accountability and integrity. And you can see how corrupt those people are, those commentators and editors, because if Rishi Sunak was going to bring a return to professionalism, accountability and integrity, and they were applauding that, then how could they also have been applauding the people who Sunak was positing as the opposite of professionalism, accountability and integrity? So, Boris Johnson, great. Liz Truss, great. Brexit, great. Cameron, great. Oh, thank God Sunak's taking us back to professionalism, accountability and integrity. Do you see what I mean? You stop and think for 30 seconds about the bilge that comes out of these people's mouths, and you realise how utterly bonkers it all is. And now David Cameron is back in the cabinet. We'll talk about that later in the programme. My initial reaction to it is changing as the dust settles. But it is Braverman, and the pretty grim observation, two things that I'd quite like to be wrong about. The first is that she wanted a riot this weekend. She wanted much, much more violence on the streets of London. She was expecting many, many more far-right thugs to answer her call. And the second thing is that if it had happened, Sunak wouldn't have got rid of her. Thank God for the Metropolitan Police, and that is not something that you will hear me say very often on this programme. But today, thank you. Thank you, Sir Mark Rowley. And thank you, the men and women of the Metropolitan Police Service, who once again risked their lives and their safety to keep the peace that the Home Secretary desperately wanted to explode. Steve's in Chingford. Steve, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello,
Great
Steve.
show.
Thank you,
Great
mate.
speech. I think Suella Braverman made a calculation. She calculated that the police are very unpopular at the moment. Yeah, they're always being put down for racism, homophobia, etc.
Yes.
Some of it rightly. And she calculated that if I put the police down, I'll become popular.
Yeah.
You know, I'll create a riot, and people will stand up and say, "Wow, Suella Braverman was right. She must be a good Home Secretary."
How could she not have thought people would attack the police after what she said and did last week?
I think she thought they would,
Yeah.
and she thought they'd make her popular. You know, she'd have loads more voters, loads more support.
What did she get wrong then?
I think she miscalculated.
Where's the miscalculation? Apart from
I think
small numbers that
people
turned
are
up, the small numbers that
necessarily
answered her call.
Yeah, exactly. So that it shows that people are not necessarily anti-police. You know, there are a lot of people who support the police. Her calculation was most people don't support the police. Most of the press, you know, etc. And her calculation was, I'll jump on the bandwagon, I'll put the police down, therefore I'll be more popular. Which unfortunately, or not unfortunately, fortunately, she was wrong.
Fortunately she was wrong, and unfortunately the police stepped up to the plate. It could be the other way as well. She could perhaps have thought that they would respond to her accusation that they were biased by going in much harder on the peace protesters, and that would have caused the sort of flare-ups that she wanted. She may not have needed the knuckle-dragging hooligans to come along if somehow the police were fired up to prove that they weren't biased, which of course they're not. The idea that you compare a peace march to a gathering that was illegal under COVID rules and claim that the police are heavy-handed at one and not at the other is just silly. I mean, they can be simultaneously true, but to compare them to each other is ridiculous. Not just the Met, we should add, Steve, of course. 1,000 police officers deployed from elsewhere across England and Wales at the weekend. And no doubt in the minds of most of those officers that the violence they faced, the violence they witnessed or saw or could have encountered was a consequence of the actual Home Secretary's words. So, I mean, the grim bit of this is the fact that if it had kicked off on a spectacular scale, she'd be claiming vindication and Sunak couldn't have sacked her. That's mad. It really is. I wish I had a more intellectual word. I wish I had a more sort of sophisticated analysis, but it's just mad. The Home Secretary putting the police at risk deliberately, cynically, and driven entirely by ambition and probably homophobia. Nick's in Willesden Green. Nick, what would you like to say?
Hello. For me, it's just, I like to just scream accountability. And
what about professionalism and integrity? What have they done to upset you?
Well, again, there's so much in the room.
Yes.
Like going back to what you said earlier about Rishi Sunak and his accountability, integrity, blah, blah, blah. This time last year, I really wanted, after Truss, Boris Johnson, someone with just a bit of sensibility in office. And then when Rishi comes in, what's one of his first things? He rehires the person who, I don't know what even, again, accountability.
She was fired for a breach of national security and a breach, I think, of the ministerial code.
Yes, ministerial code. So I was struggling to find the term. Did she resign? Did she get sacked?
She was fired. It was Liz Truss let her present it as a resignation, but everyone knows she was fired.
But then again, that goes back down to the accountability. Truss presented it as resignation. And again, accountability. Sunak, this person's just been out of a job less than 6 days and you reappoint her. So where's your integrity? But we never questioned that. Fast forward to now, and even like I'm seeing the newspaper articles, she's being sacked. I'm trying to read the fine print. Has she tendered her resignation? No, it's a cabinet.
No, this is a straight sacking. This one is. There's no doubt about it.
But then sacking based on what? Again, it goes back down to the
reason given is the attack on the police last week, which she did actually try to resile from over the weekend. So it would suggest that she was pushing her luck, but didn't actually want to get fired.
But then again, that's getting buried in the headlines because I was searching the news. So again, there's no accountability for that. And these self-serving people, Johnson, Truss,
Cameron.
And Cameron less so. No, Cameron, you are right. Sorry.
If you'd done what he did at work, you would not be coming back as joining the board 7 years later.
But then, if I did what Boris Johnson did or Liz Truss did, I think I'd be kicked out of the country. So, again, don't get me wrong, what Cameron did was unforgivable, but then the people that followed...
He did it out of complacency, arrogance, and a sense of entitlement and a misplaced faith in his own abilities. He didn't do it out of depravity, moral corruption, or epic narcissism. So you're right. I'll give you that. What's driving Sunak then, quickly? Because I need to catch up with Natasha about all the other ins and outs.
I was going to say, I said to all my friends that right now, with this reshuffle, I've really got my fingers crossed that we get a Caucasian male Home Secretary now, so that hopefully the undertones of racism that this government is pushing can at least be buried a bit further than how...
I don't quite follow you, because you've got James Cleverly as Home Secretary.
Oh, is he? Oh, crud. Okay.
But why did you say Caucasian? Sorry, I'm being a bit thick.
Because I think there's certain things that I can't picture a world where a Caucasian minister would have been able to push through the Rwanda plan.
Wow. Okay. No, I hear you. Okay, so you think that her ethnicity gave her some cover from...
Sajid Javid, Priti Patel's...
Okay. You're a man of colour, are you, Nick?
Yes, I am. Yes.
Okay. I feel I need to check that, because you're saying things that I wouldn't feel comfortable saying as a white man, but that doesn't mean I necessarily disagree with you. I just wanted to establish where you were speaking from.
Yes, sorry. I am, as a brown person, as a Muslim person, and again, even the things are so undercover now, like the Islamophobia, I can't point to a banner and say that's Islamophobic, but I can point to the fact that my wife, who wears a headscarf, isn't comfortable walking the streets because, like London, she didn't want to go anywhere near because because she'll be more easily offended by somebody saying terrorist to her.
Yeah,
and
which we saw footage of at the weekend, and that is clearly Islamophobic. But we saw it at a railway station being filmed. But the Mail on Sunday's editor David Dillon elected instead to report upon Michael Gove being jostled. 10:47 is the time.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10 minutes to 11 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. On a strange day for British politics, I think we dodged a very, very big bullet this weekend. I think the Home Secretary wanted a race riot on the streets of London, and the only reason it didn't happen was because a relatively paltry number of far-right thugs answered her call. So paltry, in fact, that one of their self-appointed leaders, Little Tommy Ten Names, did a runner in a Pride taxi shortly after leading his band of brave patriots into Chinatown. And the second reason is that Mark Rowley played a blinder, and the Metropolitan Police and their colleagues from elsewhere in the country once again rose to the challenge of keeping our country safe, keeping our people safe. And when you think it can't get any madder, David Cameron has just been made Foreign Secretary. Yes, Davy Cameron, the big pie himself, has been made Foreign Secretary. The man who started the accelerated decline that in many ways began in 1969 when Rupert Murdoch bought The Sun. But anyway, we'll focus on the details. Natasha Clark is LBC's Deck Chairs editor, currently on the deck of the Titanic, telling us which deck chairs have been moved, which have stayed in place, and which are yet to have their fate sealed. There is a slight delay on the line, so I will very uncharacteristically limit my interventions and questions and leave the floor clear for Natasha Clark.
Morning, James. Thanks for having me. Yes, it's been a very exciting morning in Downing Street so far. Like you say, the main headline news, twofold. Firstly, that Suella Braverman has been sacked as Home Secretary by Rishi Sunak, but that has possibly been knocked off the headlines by the fact that David Cameron has been brought back in a sensational, shocking return as Foreign Secretary. James Cleverly moves from Foreign Secretary to Home Secretary to replace Suella Braverman. But yes, the main news of the day still yet to happen, because we've got lots of ministers now that are in junior positions that have been resigning this morning. A few from the Department for Health and also the Department for Education have announced that they will step back from their roles. So all of the action could still be yet to come. We've had a little bit of reaction just coming in from David Cameron. He says that though I may have disagreed with some individual decisions Rishi Sunak made, it is clear to me Rishi Sunak is a strong and capable Prime Minister who is capable of showing exemplary leadership at a difficult time, he said on X this morning. However, it's going to be pretty tricky for Rishi Sunak to make the argument that he is the man of change when he's bringing back a guy who not only was Prime Minister, but also, quit after Brexit and, led to all of this chaos that we've been seeing in government for the past few years.
Indeed. It's Lord Cameron to you now, isn't it? Or how does that get pushed through? Don't worry about answering that. I'll work it out. When you say that people are resigning, I noticed Will Quince is one of the people that submitted their letters. These are acts, entirely voluntary acts, are they, Natasha? Or are they people that have been told that their number's up?
I think it's just the case that Rishi Sunak is probably getting into place his top team, which he hopes will then be the same team that goes into the election. So anyone who is quitting as an MP, we know Will Quince, Health Minister, is going to be stepping down at the next election, so he probably won't want to be fighting it in terms of in the ministerial role. So yes, there are a few people, including Nick Gibb, the Schools Minister. He's served as Schools Minister for about 10 years, so a bit of an end of an era there as well. So this is the PM getting his ducks in a row. We've also seen Therese Coffey, the Environment Secretary, go into number 10, and we have not seen her come out. Now, the rumour was that she was going to be demoted or possibly even sacked in this reshuffle. However, the fact that she's gone in the front door of number 10, she's given us a nice little shot of her bending down to stroke Larry the cat on the way in. But yes, the fact that she's going in the front perhaps says that maybe she will just be moved to a different job. We're also not hearing anything about Steve Barclay, the Health Secretary. He has also been rumoured that he could possibly be moved in this reshuffle as well. We have been told that Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, will stay for now.
On a more personal note, Natasha, you've been covering this sort of thing for a few years now. The Richter scale, if you like, of lobby journalist, of political journalist shock when David Cameron turned up. Where was the needle?
That's pretty much a 9 on the Richter scale of earthquakes, I'd say. Not much really that can beat seeing the former Prime Minister walking up Downing Street just sort of 6 years or so after he quit. Obviously, he quit after the Brexit vote. A few months later, quit as an MP. Obviously, since then, he's still been keeping in the headlines, obviously, all of the saga over the Greensill capital row and the lobbying scandal that we saw at the heart of government. He's also been in a number of other jobs and consultancy work backstage. But the reports were that he was actually quite bored with life outside of government, and as far as 2018 have been lobbying for another job back in government. So he's finally got his wish. He's back at the centre of power.
Why has Sunak done it?
Hard to say. I think, obviously, like I say, it does put up a contradiction of him trying to be the man of change by bringing back a man from the past. It doesn't really quite resonate with that message. But I think what he will want to do, and Number 10 keen to say this morning that they want a government of unity. Number 10 spokesperson told us today that this will mean bringing together a cabinet who is united. And obviously that's a little bit of a hint at the Home Secretary, who obviously did not agree with Rishi Sunak on a lot of things behind the scenes. And I think as we go into this Rwanda Supreme Court judge hearing on Wednesday, where we're expected to hear from the Supreme Court whether the Rwanda policy is legal or not, Rishi Sunak will want all of his government to be speaking with one voice and be united on the big issues, including the Rwanda policy. And we know how much the Home Secretary wanted to push him further on this. She wanted to be able to say the government should leave the European Court of Human Rights. However, David Cameron obviously has disagreed with Rishi Sunak over some policies, including notably the Rwanda policy in recent months. Speaking to our colleague Nick Ferrari just a few months ago, he did not seem to be hugely happy with the prospect of it. So yes, we'll be seeing that play out in the coming days when this Supreme Court hearing comes back, and we'll be expecting that on Wednesday morning. And
HS2, of course. Natasha Clark, many thanks. I'm glad you left some space there in answer to the question of why Rishi Sunak has reappointed David Cameron. David Cameron is a pie, I think, was the best sort of political epitaph for his career. But why? Because we can answer that question together after the 11 o'clock news. Just a little bit of self-protection, Nell, if you allow. James, you left out the other main reason why the disaster was averted this weekend, i.e. the hundreds of thousands of peace protesters who acted peacefully. I have repeatedly made that point, Nell, but I appreciate not everybody is hanging on my every word or indeed tuning in from the very beginning of the programme. Arfana is in Reading. Arfana, what would you like to say?
Yes, I mean, hi there. Hi
Hello.
there, James, long-time listener. And I normally do agree with a lot of what you say.
Good.
So this is a stand
Quite right too. I don't make it up, you know.
No, which is good. considering the state of journalism and the way it's reported nowadays,
Yes.
Which is quite dire in most parts. But yes, and I'm glad you mentioned, because I was also going to say that a large part of why there wasn't horrendous race riots and cultural wars going on the streets in London this weekend, this Saturday, was because of the brilliant policing done and the level-headedness of the pro-Palestinian march for the most of it.
Yes.
Although there were some
there were some scumbags saying some scummy things, and there were some pretty grim banners as well. But compared to trying to attack police officers unprovoked, well, it's sticks and stones, isn't it? I think versus words.
Divisive politics and identity politics does that. It brings out the worst of all sections, from all sections of the community. It will draw those people in because they are looking for an opportunity to do what it is they want to do. And Suella Braverman, if you listen to her rhetoric from since she's been made Home Secretary, the Islamophobia she showed when she openly said that it was Muslim Pakistani men who were
the Mail on Sunday had to apologise for that. The only recorded time in history when a newspapers had to apologise for the words of a Home Secretary.
Exactly, but she didn't.
No, she didn't.
And Rishi Sunak stood by her.
Yeah.
And I think that actually shows I would say disdain for the Prime Minister as well, because he didn't rein her in then. And I'm sorry I'm using that word, but he didn't sort of like say, this is divisive politics. And if the Conservative Party is here for everyone, then that sort of language, that sort of rhetoric and politics needs to be stopped. And because he didn't do it then, she thought she had the full...
Oh, it's one of those sackings that makes everybody look bad. It looks, he still looks weak and late, and she still looks disgusting. And actually, I suppose, also a busted flush, because she actually did roll the dice on national security, and thankfully she failed. If it had kicked off, I think she'd still be in the job, bizarrely, because she would then claim vindication, wouldn't she?
Yeah. Yeah, and so would Rishi Sunak. I mean, the thing is, both Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman had tried their utmost to stop the pro-Palestinian march from going ahead. He had called the Met in. He then put it at the Met's doorstep, saying, if things go wrong, it will be on your shoulders. So they were both firing gun off the...
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Of course, I'd forgotten about that bit. It's all on you. You will be That's incredible, Arfana. Exactly. So the Home Secretary blows her whistle. The far-right thugs turn up, and the police officer in charge, who's uncomfortable with the language of hate marches anyway, is told that if it all kicks off, it'll be your fault.
Yeah.
You've run out of road. We've run out of time. But I'd forgotten about that element of them. How absolutely incredible! And then for political anoraks, as opposed to genuine patriots who don't want the streets of London to be turned into a bloodbath, as in people who find Suella Braverman despicable, I suppose the slightly more gossipy element of political events this morning is the David Cameron appointment. And I don't know that any of the so-called experts have really pulled together a proper answer yet as to why he's done it. He's a very unpopular politician with pretty much everybody, I would say. Brexiters hate him, although, it should probably add that they hate almost everyone and everything. But Brexiters hate him, Remainers hate him, Tories in their current iteration hate him. Who likes him? Can I do a phone-in on that? Probably a bit unfair. Why has Sunak brought him back? Well, your guess is as good as mine, and we'll listen to both, yours and mine, after this.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 5 minutes after 11. I'll read a text from Gary, because the difficulty of operating a telephone is eluding him at the moment, so he can't ring in. He says, James, you're full of tosh, the epitome of woke. I have tried to phone you, but I can't get through. Suella is the politician, and I think I can say without contradiction, the working class applaud. However, the tree huggers like yourself oppose the boats, homeless, etc. No, it's her that opposes the homeless, mate. But chose to hide behind this thin veneer of false humanity. The only reason you think you win an argument is with your fancy words and misplaced education. That's me told, Gary. Honestly, it's a miracle I can get up and do the rest of the programme after being so roundly kneecapped by your expert analysis. Listen, mate, if you think you're speaking for the working class, you're a prat. It's one of the great rules of British politics, whoever you are, whether you're speaking up with things that I might agree with or whether you're speaking things I might disagree with. If you claim you're speaking for the working class, you're a prat. It's a golden rule. But at least Idiot's Corner has its first entrant this morning. 6 minutes after 11 is the time. Right, clear the board. Apologies. That's quite enough about Suella Braverman. I've now seen Anne Widdecombe on both the BBC and Sky News, which means that producers across the country are really, really struggling to find anybody prepared to speak in defence of either Suella Braverman or David Cameron's reappointment to the cabinet. I can't tell what it is that she's actually talking about, but my God, if Anne Widdecombe is on television, then I can tell you now, contacts books throughout Westminster and beyond have been shredded. Widdecombe is what you find. You get to the end of you phoned every possible guest to come onto a programme, and they've all said no, and then you ring them all again and beg, and they've all said no. And then in the corner of every newsroom in the country, there is a small red glass with a small red sort of pod with a glass front on it. And it says, in case of emergency, break glass. And if you break the glass, then inside you will find Anne Widdecombe's phone number. Which means if you have failed utterly to get any vaguely sensible, respectable or authoritative voice to answer a question that you as a programme editor feel needs answering, in this case, either, why has he appointed David Cameron, or why was Suella Braverman trying to cause a race riot this morning, then Anne Widdecombe would be the last. What comes after the last resort? What comes after the last resort? It's a bit like asking, what do you find after you've scraped the bottom of the barrel? Soil, I suppose, or grit. But anyway, Anne Widdecombe I've now seen on both Sky News and the BBC, which means that although today feels like a significant moment in British politics, an awful lot of the problems that beset both the political and the media landscapes remain firmly in place. So, this is a very strange appointment. I think I may owe the boy wonder, Henry Riley, an apology, because I was suggesting earlier today when the announcement was first made that it is perhaps not quite as shocking as everybody thinks it is. For the Lord Carrington precedent, the fact that Peter Carrington was both a member of the House of Lords and the Secretary of State Foreign Secretary, I think, when the Argentinians invaded the Falklands, something which saw him resign in an instance of individual ministerial responsibility. But actually, the more I think about it, the stranger it appears. So here's my early analysis. He needs somebody who is going to be unquestionably loyal up to and including any ambitions to replace him. So David Cameron, unless I am made of jelly, David Cameron will not be eyeing the opportunity to take over as leader of the party and or prime minister in the event of Rishi Sunak coming a cropper. We can agree about that, right? So that's a given. And that's quite a small group of people. I mean, to be fair, when a prime minister appoints his senior team, almost everybody in it will have at least part of one eye on the prospect of taking over as prime minister. I mean, they all believe that they're somehow capable. Even Nadine Dorries would have thought at some point that she could have a crack at becoming, but they almost all do. Oddly, the only high-profile politician of the last few years who almost certainly never thought there was any chance whatsoever of becoming Prime Minister until he became leader of the Labour Party was probably Jeremy Corbyn, actually. And I say that as a compliment, not as a criticism. But the rest of them, if they're getting appointed to high office, they will always be thinking, as Johnson explained, if the ball breaks from the back of the scrum, then it may fall to me to pick it up and run with it. So he's loyal. He will be able to portray himself as prioritising party over personal interests, which is nonsense because he's been running around the world doing the bidding of very, very rich people, some of whom may or may not have been quite dodgy, practically since he hung up the prime ministerial pinny. So he's going to be loyal and he's not going to want to take over. And he's got very serious frontline experience. He was prime minister for 6 years. He won a general election. So he's got somehow, despite us all thinking of him as one of the greatest losers of modern times, he does have electoral victory, 1.5 electoral victories. He won one general election outright, and he won one to the degree that he was able to form a coalition government to get a working majority in Parliament. So, I mean, odd though it may seem to younger listeners, he is perceived in some quarters as a winner. He lost the referendum the year after he won the general election, but he did win the general election. He delivered a decent majority against the odds and against Ed Miliband. Chaos, remember? Chaos with Ed Miliband. That was his catchphrase. Vote for me and avoid chaos with Ed Miliband, said David Cameron in 2015. Whew. And then just look at the next 8 years that unravelled after that pronouncement. So there's that. So experience, status, you know, like it or not, he fits the dictionary definition of a statesman, even of an elder statesman. He is a former prime minister. Didn't have that many big jobs before becoming prime minister, oddly, before becoming leader of the party, but that's partly because the Tories were in opposition for so long, and a lot of that generation rose in opposition. So power, he has experience of power, and his loyalty is unquestioned. So we'll put that on one side of the scale, right? Now, the bit where I get befuddled, the bit where I get confused, is when we start assembling the weights to go on the other side of the scale, which could be loosely described as baggage. The baggage that David Cameron brings now to the Foreign Office is surely going to outweigh the questionable notion that he is a genuine statesman and or a winner, a proven winner, and the loyalty, which I think is a given. Now, that's the thing that I don't think is challengeable. Listen, it's a phone-in. You can challenge it if you want, but I cannot for the life of me imagine seeing David Cameron pitching for Rishi Sunak's job anytime soon. So you've got loyalty and absence of leadership ambitions, plus experience and statesman-like record. That's on one side of the scales. Now, on the other side of the scales, you've got austerity and Brexit. Now, friend Gary, he probably thinks austerity and Brexit were a good idea, but I think it's fair to say that the constituency of people still clinging to that obvious nonsense is both shrinking and probably irredeemable now. If you're not ready to admit that austerity was a disaster and that Brexit is an unfolding disaster, then I don't know that reality is ever going to breach the processed pork products that pass for your brain. So who exactly looks at David Cameron's baggage and doesn't see a problem? Well, exactly, because he also campaigned for Remain. So even if you're a mutton-headed member of the ERG and you still think that austerity and Brexit were good ideas, you can't forgive him for being the leader of the Remain campaign, or the de facto leader of the Remain campaign. And he is woke, I suppose, or wet, or whatever the word of the week is to describe people who don't join in with the feasting on racist red meat that Suella Braverman has been serving up for the last couple of weeks. So why has he done it? Most recently, it was the Greensill scandal. He made a reported £3.3 million from shares in a company that subsequently collapsed. MPs report. Listen, I mean, this matters, you know. I know it's a bit of a stuck record. An MP's report in 2021, I think it was July, accused Mr. Cameron of a, and I quote, significant lack of judgment in lobbying the government on behalf of the company. He was employed by this outfit called Greensill. In 2020, he tried to persuade ministers to let Greensill join a scheme called the Corporate COVID Financing Facility, which was basically loans issued on incredibly preferential terms and insured by the government. And they failed. They were unsuccessful. He was unsuccessful in securing these cushy little loans for the company's founder, Lex Greensill. And then by 2021, the entire company collapsed with the loss of 440 jobs and possible £1 billion losses for investors. But although he won't tell us how much he was paid, that's the point, you know. He's now coming back as Foreign Secretary with a financial scandal in his near past and a refusal to tell us how much he was paid by that company anyway. It's quite incredible. He has said that he was paid far more than his salary as Prime Minister. It was Panorama that found a letter from Greensill Capital to David Cameron, which suggests that he made £3.29 million after selling a bunch of shares he was given in the now collapsed company in 2019. This isn't normal. Well, maybe it is, but it's not right. So that's just one bit of baggage that you probably had forgotten about or didn't know about in the first place. So forget austerity and Brexit. We've got here taking millions of pounds from a company that went bust, and for which he sought to secure cushy government-insured loans. No breaching of the rules, but a significant lack of judgment. The most recent thing that British members of Parliament have said about David Cameron was that he demonstrated a significant lack of judgment in lobbying the government on behalf of a company that shortly afterwards went bust. So Rishi Sunak's made him Foreign Secretary. What's that you've got there, Dave? Oh, a significant lack of judgment, Rishi. Excellent. And £3.29 million. Now, that's the kind of language I talk. Would you like to be Foreign Secretary? Can I have a seat in the House of Lords? Of course you can. We'll make you a baron. Off you go. Job's a good one. Who waves their little nylon flag at this one, I wonder? Theresa May has come out with some warm words, but you can kind of understand why. She's nostalgic for the days when her party wasn't ruled over by obviously ridiculous individuals. Cameron is ridiculous, but not obviously so. Who cheers this? That's a question for the ages. Who cheers this? 0345 606 0973. So those are your two questions. Number one, why has Rishi Sunak made David Cameron Foreign Secretary? And I want serious answers only. That's not true. I'll take silly answers as well. 0345 606 0973. And the second question is, who cheers this? Seriously. Just like politically. Who in the party, the country, or even on Fleet Street? Who cheers this? Now, the News International, News Corps, or whatever they're called at the moment, they historically love him. Cameron made Andy Coulson his Director of Communications shortly before Andy Coulson went to jail for his deep involvement in the phone hacking scandals. His boss, Rebecca Wade, was writing to David Cameron before a big conference speech saying that they couldn't wait to work together. That's fair enough, you know. What's the point in operating a massive media organisation if you can't keep a Prime Minister in your pocket? But I don't know if they still like him now. I don't know if they still sort of have suppers together or if they still... So who cheers this? That's the same question in a way. Because if you tell me who cheers this, then the question of why has Rishi Sunak appointed David Cameron as Foreign Secretary possibly becomes easier to answer. But right now, I've got nothing.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 21 minutes after 11. Dominic's in Manchester. So our Prime Minister, elected by no one, not even Tory party members, has put into office a disgraced ex-PM as Foreign Secretary, whom as a Lord will not be able to be scrutinised by the elected MPs in the House of Commons. What an odd version of democracy we have these days. Although it is odder still that a Lord can still actually become Prime Minister. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But at least we got our country back, Dominic. I think you've got to focus on the positives. At least we control our borders. Hey. At least we got our country back. At least the NHS is going great guns with all that money that was freed up by leaving the European Union. And the food is cheap. The cost of living has come, cheap shoes for peasants is what Jacob promised us. And that's what we've got. Yeah. Hassan is in Boreham Wood. Hassan, what would you like to say? Why David Cameron?
I think David Cameron is a...
Pie.
Well, that too. But I think they
Sorry.
I mean, like, if you look at what's happened over the last year, the Tories have been in the polls, getting hammered in the polls. And their only hope or their strategy was culture wars. That's, take a leaf out of Donald Trump's book and saying that, well, this is the only thing that will avoid complete disaster.
Yeah.
And I think that on the Friday, Rishi Sunak was also hoping for a riot, for thousands of people to turn up.
Do you really?
100%.
Saturday, or he was hoping on Friday that they'd turn up on Saturday.
On the Saturday.
Yeah.
That hasn't happened, and he's like, well, okay, the culture wars isn't working.
Yeah.
And now I think in the background maybe he'd been thinking that, well, if this doesn't pan out, what's our plan B? And our plan B is the One Nation Conservative, to bring them back into the fold, because they're getting more and more disgusted if you hit the Rory Stewarts of this world, are absolutely appalled at the way that the direction of the Conservative Party, Saeed Varsi, absolutely appalled at the direction it's going in. So what is your plan B? The plan B is to try and go more middle ground, to try and appeal to One Nation Conservatives, to avoid a complete and utter disaster. Which is
but these people don't hold David Cameron in very high regard.
They don't. But who else? He's isolated himself from everyone. Who else has he got left?
So it's an abandonment of the culture war for Sunak.
I think
that's interesting. It'd be interesting to see whether 30p Lennox stays as deputy party chairman, won't it? Later today.
I can't see that.
Well, he could try and have his cake and eat it, couldn't he?
Possibly keep
Cameron.
a couple in.
But then who else could you have brought back if that's what you were trying to do? So I'm just thinking of the disaffected Tory voter who sees Cameron's weakness in the face of xenophobia and Euroscepticism.
He also did win an election,
yes,
and he did win a 1.5, and people are. So I think. So, for example, if you're a voter that could vote one way or the other, and once upon a time you thought, well, Cameron, mate,
I'm not having it. There's no one in the country. Well, listen, I've got one phone line free. There's no one in the country who is now, as of 11:25 this morning, returning to the Conservative fold because they've made David Cameron Foreign Secretary.
I don't think they're returning to the fold because they've made David Cameron Secretary. I'm thinking that if over the next 6 months. If there's a little bit of a move towards middle ground and you have to remove these culture war anarchists in that, then they could avoid utter disaster.
But then they're going to infuriate people on their own benches, aren't they? They're going to infuriate people like 30p Lennox and Andrea Andrea Jenkins.
But the voters, they're not getting enough voters. Their polls are just getting absolutely hammered week after week.
You might say that, but Gary's certain that they speak for the working class, Hassan.
Yeah, I mean, Gary, what do I say to Gary?
You don't have to. It's 11:26 is the time. I can't hear you anyway. He's in Idiot's Corner. Well, it's still a mystery. Hassan's had a fair crack of the whip. There's some sense in what he says. You're the Hassan I'm thinking of, aren't you?
I'm not sure.
You were a candidate many moons ago for the Conservative Party.
No.
No, that's someone else. A different Hassan in Boreham Wood. I do apologise, but the notion of a One Nation Conservative coming back is strong. I mean, it's a banner under which people might march, but not if David Cameron's the one holding the banner. That's the bit I don't get. I don't believe there is a single person listening to this programme, except possibly Theresa May, who is genuinely going, "Good one, Rishi. Good one." What do you think? Are you? Because I could easily be missing something. I think Michael Heseltine might be saying warmish words about... I don't know. I can't tell. Alison's in Bury St Edmunds. Alison, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Well, basically what made me pick up the phone was that chat that you read the text out probably about sort of 10 or so minutes ago. And I wonder where these people are coming from. I'm glad Suella's gone. She should never have been put in post. For the second time. I agree with what Wes Streeting was saying this morning because he said exactly the same. As for David Cameron, well, that's kind of come as a bit of a curveball, isn't it? It's come out of left field and we're all going,
Saida likes it. Yeah. Saida Varsi likes it. She says, "Welcome back, David Cameron. If ever there was a time for balanced, thoughtful, compassionate leadership, it is now. Your country needs you." I like Saida Varsi and she likes David Cameron, and that fits with Hassan's analysis a moment ago. So there you go. There is some flesh on that particular bone.
Well, that was brings me to my next point because I think for Rishi, he's a safe bet.
Yes.
And I think... what I like, see, I don't want the Boris Johnsons and someone who I can go down the pub with and, come on, mate. I want somebody, whether I agree with their policies or not, or all of their policies or some of their policies, I want somebody who is statesman-like, who, okay, they may say the odd thing and make the odd mistake, but Suella does not speak for me. I have listened to so many commentators this week, so many news items, and listened to them agreeing with her, shouting at the radio, sending in text messages, She does not speak for me, and they
But
all
what were
think
they
she
agreeing
does.
with? I mean, that was the strangest thing, wasn't it? Is that you have a march and it is polluted by some deeply unsavoury elements, albeit rhetorical. I mean, words rather than actions, which we normally distinguish between. But even if you don't want to distinguish between it, "Death to all the Jews" was what one woman was filmed, and I hope her feet don't touch the ground. I hope that her collar is felt so tightly that she struggles to breathe. But. And it's a very big but, 300,000 plus people on a march, and there is simply no evidence that the overwhelming majority of them were doing anything hateful at all.
Exactly.
And she describes them as hate marchers, and you know,
which is totally wrong. There was one man I listened to this weekend, and he's a veteran, and he was in the Invictus Games as well. His name's Johnny Ball. You may know of him.
Yes, I do.
And he was on Talk TV yesterday morning. Ugh. He put a tweet out yesterday, and I agreed with him. I'm ex-military.
Right.
I went to the parade in Both and Edmund yesterday. Perfect. I didn't think there was going to be problems. I think I sent a message into you saying we don't need the cenotaph looking after by these right-wing people.
It needed to be protected by the people that Suella Braverman summoned. They're the ones that were threatening it, and they're the ones that were attacking the police.
Exactly. And there was enough people. I mean, did you see the contingents of military around it yesterday?
Of course.
We didn't need them people coming down in coaches.
But Braverman summoned them. She said it's a hate march, and people. I saw people saying we need to make a stand against. So that's Islamophobia. That is trying to conflate enemies of the state based upon accidents of birth with the idea that they were hate marchers. But you've jumped off message a bit, and I'm a tiny bit late for the news. Why Cameron?
It's a safe bet. And he's
just
not
that. It's just a safe bet. And the talent pool is such a thin puddle. Well, I mean, what's smaller than a puddle? It's not a talent pool. It's not even a talent puddle. It's a talent test tube. It's a talent test tube. It's a talent Petri dish, which contains so few viable candidates that he's ended up going for David Cameron is a pie as Foreign Secretary. Unbelievable. More answers to this question. Why? Why David Cameron? Why? Sensible answers, silly questions, serious answers, whatever you want. Thomas Watts has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 11:34 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where questions that I never thought I'd ask, chapter 563, is well underway. Why has Rishi Sunak, imagine if you've just woken up, this is the first you've heard of it. I say, why has Rishi Sunak made David Cameron Foreign Secretary? And you've just checked your radio. What's broken? What's happened? It's on some sort of glitch. I'm supposed to be in full control, you might say to yourself. I'm listening on Global Player, where you are in control. You can rewind. Are you rewinding live radio at the moment to see if I'm going to say it again? Why has David Cameron been made Foreign Secretary by Rishi Sunak? What? James has finally taken leave of his senses. So the enormous success of his new book has gone to his head, and he's finally left the building. Why has Rishi Sunak made David Cameron Foreign Secretary? Okay, strong answers, actually. If I were to knit together contributions so far, he's calling time on the culture wars. Where does that leave 30p Leenock? Only time will tell. Saeed Avasi pointing out that, well, I don't know if he was stable. He had to, you would argue, wouldn't you, that he had to call the referendum because he promised one. He wasn't expecting it to happen because he thought he was going to be in coalition again, and he'd be able to say the Liberal Democrats won't let me have one. But balanced, thoughtful, compassionate leadership. I'm not having it. But in answer to the question of who likes it, we've now got some answers to that. But balanced, thoughtful, compassionate leadership. This is remarkable. I tell you, I mentioned the break glass in emergencies and get Anne Widdecombe's phone number out if there's an absolute impossibility of booking anybody good. They've actually now started booking some sort of elder statespeople to talk about this, because no one in the current Conservative Party is going to want to go on telly and make sense of the madness that's unfolding around them. I am quite interested in hearing what, for example, Michael Heseltine has to say on the subject, or even a Malcolm Rifkind. But you're looking now at historians of the Tory party, and indeed history of the Tory party. The current Tory party is in such epic disarray that nobody can make head nor tail of it. Do you think that Nadine Dorries might be coming back? Give her a seat in the Lords? Make her Chancellor? I'm joking. Or am I? Fen's in T-Bay in Cumbria. Fen, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Hi. Thanks for speaking to me.
You're very welcome.
I'd just like to say I'm really glad to see Cameron back.
Good.
Yeah, personally. I've got a bit of an issue with your attitude towards David Cameron.
Fair enough.
And it's quite a common attitude I find in the country. He's kind of the fall guy and the bit of the bogeyman when it comes to Brexit. And I think it's just worth remembering that, you know, like you said, the first time he came into power, it was with a coalition, right? He dominated that coalition and he did the austerity stuff and brought all that in. And that was for a very specific reason, right? Which is, I bet you can tell me what that is.
Well, you want me to tell you what you're saying to me?
I don't want you to tell me what you're saying to me, but I can tell you. So they brought austerity in because our AAA credit rating was under threat, I believe. Is that right?
That would be part of the rationale, but no other country cut public spending back as far as we did, despite the fact that the 2008 financial crisis was global. And you'll remember, you don't need me to tell you that Alistair Darling and Gordon Brown had already got things back on a fairly good footing, and we were moving very much in the right direction by 2010, but they undid all of that.
But only through quantitative easing.
Well, that carried on under Cameron.
Absolutely, but that was not a long-term plan. The long-term plan was to get this country back into the black.
How's that working out?
Well, it isn't, because he's not in power anymore, is it?
Well, he had 5 years. He had 5 years. How long do you think he needed?
He had. What do you mean?
6.
How long did he
6
need?
years. 6 years.
That's absurd. Like,
okay. Why is that absurd? How long would?
You were expecting him. You're expecting a government to be able to come in and get the country back into the black in 5 years.
No, you are.
Is that what you're... No, that's what you just
I
said.
don't think it was about getting the country back into the black. I think it was ideologically driven slashing of public services because of free market ideology that makes them look at things like spending money on healthcare and education for ordinary people as an unnecessary expense. You're the one that's... Hang on a minute, pal. You're the one that said it was designed... You are the one that said it was designed to get the... Well, you can keep talking, Fen, but I'm examining what you've said out loud.
You're doing the same thing, mate. You're not even letting me actually say anything. Like, what you're saying is what...
Okay, so here's the question. How long would it have taken for David Cameron to get the country back into the black, do you think?
I can't remember because I don't have those statistics in front of me.
How convenient. And what do you think the major break...
I'm in my kitchen, mate.
What do you think... That, no, you're on national radio, Fen. What do you think the major breach with David Cameron's economic policies was that Theresa May Boris Johnson brought in? What was the major change to austerity that they brought in, do you think?
What was the major change to it?
Yeah, because you said he only had 6 years, and I'm pointing out that they carried on the same course.
Yeah, because Hammond and May decided to abandon that policy and stopped worrying, and they went further into debt. This is
absolutely astonishing.
They took our country further into debt.
Right.
And further into debt.
Yes.
And they've just carried on printing money and putting the pound further and further into debt.
But Cameron was doing that as well.
But only on with a short-term plan.
But you just told me that you couldn't talk about 5 years because it was too short-a-term plan to talk about, and now you're saying it was a short-term plan.
No, too short-a-term in terms of the quantity.
Okay, well then, briefly, how long would David Cameron have needed, do you think, to get the country into the black?
Well, David Cameron or anybody else.
Fantastic. Are you related to him?
Anybody else would have took like 15, 20 years.
Calm down.
That's the mess that we got left in.
Yes.
The Labour Party and the NHS
is
the second biggest employer in the world.
And it had the highest ever patient satisfaction levels.
Brilliant.
Well, that is quite a good thing, isn't it, Fen, mate?
Well, that is a good thing, yeah.
Right.
But obviously that is a good thing. We want an NHS that works.
But there were too many people working for it, were there?
Well... There's too much money getting spent on it.
Right.
That was the problem, and we couldn't, as a nation.
So it had nothing to do with debt. Then it had nothing to do with debt. You just felt there was too much money being spent on the NHS.
Yeah, because that's money that was on debt. That was money that
and they're now spending more than ever.
Yeah, because they're forced into that.
And they carried on spending year on year. Cameron spent more on the NHS than he did the year before. Every single year he was in power. But he's your man. Talk me through that in your kitchen.
Yeah, I will, yeah. basically, like, the plan of Osborne and Cameron had a plan to get this country back into the black.
Don't change the subject. They spent more on the NHS year on year than they did the year before. So how are they cutting spending?
To get this country back into the black.
Well, you're going to have to answer the question, Fen, or admit that you've soiled yourself on live radio.
You're not answering my question.
Mate, it's my show. How do you explain a reduction in NHS spending when it went up every year?
How do I explain a reduction in NHS spending?
Is there an echo?
I can't.
But you just told me that's what they did.
Well, they did reduce them. I said that they tried to reduce the debt. I didn't say.
No, you didn't. You said they were spending too much money on the NHS and they had a plan to fix it. How did they fix it? By spending more every year.
Right, well, I don't know. I thought we had a problem with the NHS and they weren't spending enough money.
I'm going to keep asking you the question until either you answer it or hang up.
OK, well, give me a second. I'll have a look.
Doesn't work like that. That counts as hanging up.
No, I'm not hanging up. I'm still here. What was the question again that you want me to answer?
How does spending more money each year on the NHS equal cutting spending on the NHS?
It doesn't, does it?
Thank you, Fen. Have a great day. No, come back, actually. Give me in a sentence why David Cameron's a good appointment.
Why he's a good appointment?
There's another echo.
Basically, Cameron, is not responsible for Brexit.
Why is he a good appointment? Why is he a good appointment, Fen? These aren't trick questions, mate.
Why is he a good appointment?
Oh, my God, the echo again. Do you want to sit down? Do you want to sit down and try again in your kitchen?
Huh?
Why is he a good appointment?
Why is he a good appointment? Because he's a good politician.
Right, and the proof of that is...
He's the best Conservative politician we've had.
And the proof of that is his greatest achievement was...
winning 2 elections.
Right. But as a politician, his greatest achievement was, in policy terms...
In policy terms, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head.
And yet here you are, in front of nearly 1.5 million people.
Yeah, but I still think that Cameron's the right thing.
No, I know what you think. I'm just demonstrating you have absolutely no basis for it whatsoever. Live on the radio.
Yeah, well, that's fair enough, mate.
I know.
I think I haven't. If I had access to more statistics,
you've got access to all the statistics I've got access to.
I just said there, I'd like to go.
One policy success. That was the
same of hanging.
But just give me one policy success. Go on, one. One
policy success. I'm trying to think, mate. I can't think off the top of my head.
That's all right. Take your time.
I'll tell you one thing I did like. It's only a little thing.
Just before you say it out loud, remember people are listening, and this is the culmination of the whole call.
That's because you're ending it. You've dictated.
It's time for the break, Fen. It's 11:45. I've given you more time than anyone else today. Go on, give us the big win.
Don't hog the middle lane.
Pardon?
Don't hog the middle lane.
What are you having for lunch?
I haven't decided yet, mate.
I hope it goes better than this.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
11:48 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Why? Why David Cameron? A politician whose most ardent supporters struggle to name a single success of his government, apart from winning elections. So Sunak might think that that's somehow going to rub off on him. But he's unpopular with everybody. Beth Rigby at Sky News is reporting that she's hearing rumours of a possible leadership bid by Suella Braverman. Sometimes I think I might have dreamt things. Let me just double check that. The idea that the Tory party needs another leadership election, I don't quite know who would... Oh, okay, it's all right, she's retracted it. So she said originally, senior Conservative source tells me there is talk in Parliament of a meeting of the new Conservatives group later today, and an agenda item is a Suella leadership play. She later amended that. I've been told that the group meet every week and a leadership bid is not on the agenda. They're dancing on the head of a pin. A bid and a play are slightly different things. This is so Rigby quite rightly pointing out that the language her senior source used did not include bid. Play is a slightly different proposition. That would be a conversation about a bid. And she adds, this is surely the continuation of a long campaign. She now becomes queen over the water and can make her pitch without constraints of office. I don't know if it's too early to have a conversation about that, but as somebody who really, really regrets the last 13 years of Tory government and would comfortably never see another Tory government again in place, I think I'd quite like Suella Braverman to be leader of the Tory party. I think that 15 to 20% rump of racists and imbeciles to whom she appeals, I think that might be quite a good thing for enemies of racism and imbecility. I don't know. We shall see. Marcia is in Harlesden. Marcia, that's 2 calls from Harlesden today. What would you like to say, Marcia?
Morning. Really enjoying the show, James. Just to say that I think, and I think he's got the patience of a saint, to be frank.
You're not wrong. Carry on.
Just to say that I think the role of Foreign Secretary is going to really appeal to Cameron, because I think clearly he's always had a pretty inflated ego, yes. And therefore it kind of ticks that box. But secondly, it's the opportunity to work on the wall in Gaza and to kind of sweep in there, on his horse, being seen to be having conversations and brokering peace. Again, I think he will absolutely love that.
But the hubris involved in that is extraordinary, because it suggests he's learned nothing from the time he thought he could sweep into Brussels and secure magical concessions that didn't even exist in order to assuage the lunatic fringe of the lunatic fringe of the lunatic fringe of his own party.
But I think that's his own perception of his own kind of greatness means that's something he would absolutely appeal to him. And I think for
That's
Rishi,
not, to be fair, that's not the question.
No, I know. It's not, but I think for Rishi, because things are spiralling or have already spiraled out of control, it gives him the opportunity to have somebody who's going to play by the rules, not breathe constantly against him and say stupid stuff, basically.
Well, you go back to 2015, and Rishi Sunak is simply... It's almost like a greatest hits, isn't it? When an act wants to play the new material, the band breaks up and they want to play their new material, their solo material, but the crowd just want the classics. And David Cameron is at least a representation of proximity to a time when the party wasn't completely crackers.
Exactly. And even though, it kind of gives the sense of kind of getting a bit of normality or professionalism back.
Yes.
Because things have gone so off the rails.
Yes, that's what Syed Avasi is arguing, certainly.
Yeah. And I think it's things are so out of control now. I think they are literally staring down the barrel of complete oblivion as a party. And therefore he has to do something.
So he sees rehabilitation almost in place.
It is. Yeah, it is. It's let's try and save something.
You haven't read my book yet, have you?
No, I haven't. Is that what it says?
Well, chapter 6 actually explains everything you've just said. And you've missed out a couple of things because most people won't be aware of them. But this idea he's got, that he's possessed of a very unique set of skills, that he's possessed of particular talents and attributes, that's very much what you're describing, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. No,
it's
absolutely.
built on absolutely nothing. Do you know how his career started?
Someone gave him a job?
Yeah, he came out of Oxford. He came out of Oxford and he wanted to be a journalist. So he tried to get on the traineeships, got turned down for the graduate traineeship at the Times and elsewhere. So then he went on what's called the milk round, which is when you try and get a job in finance with a big consultancy firm or with a bank or a stockbroker. Didn't get a job there. He went to McKinsey, the consultancy firm, as part of that milk round and was interviewed by a very up-and-coming young executive. Do you know what that executive's name was?
I don't know.
William Hague. But he didn't get hired there. So his godfather or somebody else in Buckingham Palace rang the Conservative Research Department and told them that he was a very extraordinary young man. So they gave him a job. And then he decided that if he wanted to get a nice safe seat at some point in the future, he'd better get a job in the real world. Otherwise, they'd just point out that all he'd ever done was work for the Conservative Party. Do you know how he got a job in the real world?
I don't know. Someone gave him a job?
His mother-in-law rang the man that was... His future mother-in-law rang the man that was running and indeed owned most of Carlton Communications, the television company, and said, "Hello, Michael Green. It's Samantha Astor here. Do you think you could give my future son-in-law a job? He's a lovely bloke. Can't get employed anywhere else off the back of his own talents and abilities and CV. But hey-ho, what's the point of having strings if you never pull them?" And Michael Green turned around and said, "Yes, certainly, we'll make him Director of Communications." And that's the only job he ever really had in the real world. But he thinks he's a genius. It's incredible.
Well, I mean, this is what happens, doesn't it?
Yeah.
People get given positions, and rather than actually acknowledging the amount of favours and nepotism they've benefited from, they pretend it's all them.
He genuinely thinks that he is, he's possessed of some unique set of skills, and he took it with him to Brussels when he was trying to negotiate some special dispensations and concessions that just do not exist, and he brought back nothing, and the referendum became inevitable, and then he thought that his unique set of skills would somehow allow him to win the referendum, but he lost it. And I think you're absolutely right. He's been licking his wounds in his shepherd's hut in his back garden for the last 7 years, counting all the money he made from selling shares in a company that he tried to secure government-funded loans for, or government-insured loans for, shortly before it went bust. And now he's coming back, still persuaded that he's possessed of a very special set of skills. And there it, I mean, you've nailed it. That's the incredible thing. But that is not the question I was asking. What's in it for him? Rehabilitation, status, a job that is commensurate with his and his alone. Well, no, that's not true. Our friend up in the Lake District, our friend Fenn, he also thinks David Cameron is a political genius. That makes two people in the country who think David Cameron is a political genius. David Cameron and the bloke talking about the middle lane of the motorway a moment ago. That's it. That's the David Cameron fan club. God help us. Patrick's in Lambeth. Patrick, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello,
I think in sort of outlining David Cameron's earlier ascent up the greasy pole, you've just made me really cross.
Yes,
because you just reminded me why I think he's a sort of very entitled, arrogant, posh boy, along with George Osborne, and why really we need people who've actually done real jobs and got there on merit and actually have something to contribute to our political life because they've got some real substance behind them. And I'm thinking Keir Starmer is obviously somebody who's done just that, and a direct comparison, I think, with certainly David Cameron now that he's back in the cabinet. But the reason I called was really to answer your question, which is why do I think Sunak has actually picked David Cameron for this top office of state? I think there are two reasons probably that are at play here, and I think you have to start with the notion that he's concluded he has to sack Braverman, and he's concluded that putting Cleverly into the Home Office is a smart move because I think Cleverly is basically a safe pair of hands.
Also, he's done. I said about 6 months ago, Cleverly was playing a blinder by doing absolutely nothing. That's a lot harder as Home Secretary to do nothing than it is as Foreign Secretary.
Agreed. We'll see how he gets on, but I don't think we'll get these inflammatory comments about the Metropolitan Police, which I think is what Sunak probably cares about at the moment. But moving on to Cameron, why him? I think there are two reasons. I think number one is if you're Sunak, you're watching your back right now, and you'll need to see what Braverman does now she's on the back benches. But Cameron has no aspiration to be Prime Minister to get Sunak out of number 10. He's been there. He's done that. He's bought the T-shirt. He just wants some big job to do. I think it's been floated that he quite fancied another big job.
Yes, he has. He said so himself. He said so himself in 2018 that he was very bored. And therefore he quite... Imagine if you and I were bored, Patrick. And we'd think, imagine I got bored of this job, or you, God forbid, got bored of listening to it. And you'd think, oh, what can I do instead? I'm a bit bored. And David Cameron's arrogance and self-regard and sense of entitlement is such that he thinks, I know, I'll see if I can have a go at being Foreign Secretary.
I mean, I agree.
It's extraordinary.
I mean, let me make my second point, which may at least give some credence to the idea of Cameron doing that job right now. I mean, I think the second point is that Cameron, yes, he's not ever served in the Foreign Office as a minister, but he's been Prime Minister and understands how foreign affairs work by dint of assuming that role.
Fair comment.
He knows a lot of people on the world stage. They know him. I think there's a desire to move on from the bile of Brexit and, effectively having Cameron there, who is clearly a pro-Remain type of person.
But he also could represent someone who has, to coin a phrase, he has got over it. He's not going to be relitigating it, or, I mean, to be fair, nor is Keir Starmer, but it gives him a clean skin in a sense.
It does, and I think the other point is that Sunak is really very inexperienced. He doesn't understand foreign affairs, and having somebody who is not going to be looking for his job, who does understand something about it, and then, crucially, frees up Sunak to focus on the domestic agenda, which is where the next election is bound to be fought, is probably a very good thing if you're Sunak.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, as the dust settles, it actually makes a lot more sense than it did at first glance, but not necessarily I mean, it may not deliver what it is that they're hoping for, but there is some sense behind those hopes.
There is some sense, but then you get all the negatives about David Cameron, which I haven't really talked about.
No, one thinks of Danny Dyer's famous contribution to public discourse at this point, which may actually be worth an airing. And the only reason you can't talk about it further, Patrick, is because as the jingling, jangling music in the background reminds us, we're approaching the end of this hour. Listen, the appetite for continuing the David Cameron element of this conversation is much higher than the appetite for continuing the Suella Braverman element of this conversation. We could do a little bit of both. We could do one, we could do the other, or we could do neither. The decision rests entirely with me, and of course you, but not directly. I still don't know that we've got to the bottom of the why a bit. I think we've got to the bottom of why he would fancy it, but what is Rishi Sunak hoping for? I think we may explore at least a little further.
James O'Brien on LBC.
3 minutes after 12. I think we'll stay with this. I think that talking about the national security catastrophe that was narrowly averted at the weekend, one called for in terms by the sacked Home Secretary Suella Braverman. It was a very powerful hour, that, and I urge you to listen to it if you missed it. You can download the whole show every day. It's called The Whole Show, actually, and you can find it at Global Player or wherever you get your podcast. And loads of people do. Someone showed me the numbers the other day. I think it's a hangover from lockdown. I think that a lot of people must have enjoyed the programme during lockdown, and now their routine has changed. So they listen to it a little bit later in the day, but it's all there, and you'll hear that first hour, where I think we probably nailed down the seriousness of what happened at the weekend. So Suella Braverman, I believe, wanted violence on the streets of London on a scale far in excess of what we actually saw. She wanted little Tommy Ten Names and his knuckle-dragging chums to breach police security and get in among the people she has called hate marchers, remember. There's no condemnation or criticism of the actual far-right thugs, but criticism of the overwhelmingly peaceful march. And I'll say again, albeit with some disgusting elements in their midst, about which many people argue the massive majority of people should have done more. I don't know about that. I mean, someone on the tube starts playing up. I don't know when the last time you weighed in or led the intervention was, so it's always a little bit, I think, naive to suggest that other people should take it upon themselves to sort of vigilante the company that they're in and haven't chosen to be in, as in people they don't know. But I mention again that some of the placards, some of the chants were disgusting and wrong. But to label all 300,000, if that was the figure, then as hate marchers, while staying silent about the actual far-right thugs who attacked the police, is categorically disgusting. And it appeals to some people. You know, some of them still listen to this programme. I get their texts. Some of them love it. They wish there had been more violence. They think she's right when she suggests that anybody marching in opposition to the continuing bombardment of Muslim civilians in Gaza is somehow an enemy of the United Kingdom, because these people celebrate the murder or the killing of Muslims, not the murder, because it is taking place as part of a military campaign rather than a terror attack. These are the kind of semantic distinctions that it's important to remember, it's important to observe. But that conversation about what she wanted to happen is much harder to have, isn't it, than the conversation about why Rishi Sunak has put David Cameron in charge. Also, one is looking in the rearview mirror, albeit a very recent rearview mirror, and one is looking at the road ahead. The more I think about David Cameron coming back as Foreign Secretary, the more I think that Chapter 6 of the new book, How They Broke Britain, should be essential reading. The man has no qualifications, really, for high office. No, I mean, nobody does, really, but any job he had, his mother-in-law got for him. The jobs he tried to get off his own back, he failed to get. And yet the class system in this country and the sense of entitlement that you are injected with at Eton is so huge that not only did he think that he had the stones to be Prime Minister, but having failed as Prime Minister and delivered the country the most appalling generational damage through his weakness, he sat there licking his wounds in his shepherd's caravan for a few years and decided he'd quite like to have a pop at being Foreign Secretary now. Yeah, I'm bored. I keep getting into trouble hanging out with the money people. They keep going bust. I'll have a go at being I think I'd make a rather good foreign secretary. Do you know when he was asked once why he wanted to be prime minister? Do you know what he said? Do you know what he said? He said, I think I'd be rather good at it. What, I mean, why do you want to be prime minister? Well, I'm an enemy of injustice. I want to ensure that the country is equipped to face the challenges of the 21st century. I want to make sure that the NHS remains the envy of the free world. I want to make sure that the armed forces have everything they need to protect us from a new generation of threats. Why do you want to be prime minister? I want to be in charge of the education of future generations of children. I want to be in charge of the security of the nation. I want to be in charge of ensuring that the United Kingdom plays a key role on the international stage when it comes to protecting human rights and freedoms and progress. And they asked David Cameron why he wants to be prime minister. He said, I think I'd be rather good at it. I think I'd be quite good at it. And here he is, Foreign Secretary. If anyone ever tells you that there's no class system in this country or that we've progressed far from the Victorians, just show them a picture of David Cameron and ask what it is that qualifies him to hold the great offices of state, including now Foreign Secretary. The more I think about it, the madder it looks, but not for the reasons people thought at first. The madder it looks because it speaks to Rishi Sunak signing up hook, line and sinker for the whole saga of impunity, entitlement and incompetence that brought us to this pretty pass in the first place. Anyway, enough from me. Ian's in Isha. Ian, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello,
first-time caller to your show.
Welcome.
Good to speak to you. Thank you. First of all, I want to precede what I'm going to say in that I think David Cameron was the worst Prime Minister I have ever lived through, and I'm 60.
Gosh.
I include Liz Truss in that.
Blimey.
I think that austerity was not an exercise in putting the economy right.
Of course
I think it was an exercise in kicking the can down the road as far as he could kick it till he was out of the way and had made a name for himself. However, that being said, why is Rishi appointing him? He's a good smiley face. People like him and people have short memories.
Do people like him? YouGov have done some quick polling on whether people support or oppose his return as Foreign Secretary. 22% support, 53% oppose. I suppose you'd take 22% at the moment if you were Rishi Sunak.
Yeah, what I did want to say, James, and you may don't take this the wrong way because I think that.
Well, I'll try, but I can't make any promises, Ian.
Okay, I think David Cameron's the wrong man to have in any role.
Yes.
However, the policy of moving somebody from outside of Parliament into a big role, I like because it's been going on too long where we've got inept amateurs running big seats, the Home Office, the Health Secretary, education. And it's time that we stop just giving it to politicians and start bringing people in from society who've got some real experience and know how to do jobs.
But he hasn't.
I know he hasn't, James. And I preceded that with saying I don't think David Cameron's the right man.
Oh, okay. So the principle of bringing in unelected people to the very heart of government. You can bring in advisors, Ian, but Foreign Secretary?
Well, why not? I mean, if we look at the way that, and there's plenty to criticise about it, but if we look at the way that America runs their politics,
yes,
people running the big seats are, industrialists, economists, and all them people who have got a worldly life of experience at this really high level.
I'm not going to argue with you. I'm not going to argue with you about that. I can see a lot of sense in what you're saying, and of course, with the caveat that you provided, David Cameron is not the poster boy you'd want for the principle of bringing in outside expertise to government, but. And the Prime Minister is the consequence usually of democracy. It's a fairly roundabout democracy that delivered the keys of Downing Street to Rishi Sunak. So you can point that out, can't you, when someone says I didn't elect him? No one really elects a Foreign Secretary ever, do they? And the fact that someone could hold the office who hasn't been elected to Parliament shouldn't be that big an obstacle. Peter Carrington, you think of?
Yeah. And when I said I included Liz Truss in been a potentially better Prime Minister than David Cameron, the reason I say that, Liz Truss was never given an opportunity to try and do the job because she was ousted by the men in grey of the Conservative Party.
Now we are going to have a bit of a set too. I mean, her position was rendered utterly untenable by the collapse in the bond markets that almost brought Great Britain to the brink of bankruptcy, mate. And she was warned that would happen by all of the experts in the building that her and Kwasi Kwarteng chose to ignore in favour of listening to the absolute Herberts at the Institute of Economic Affairs. It's not the men in grey suits that did for her. It was the MPs in Parliament that said, we can't possibly keep you in charge. You're an absolute liability.
Yeah, but the consequence of that was we went from having an elected Prime Minister to having
Boris
a Prime
Johnson.
Minister... we'll not discuss that.
Well, he was elected. Truss was never elected. She was appointed essentially by the Conservative Party membership.
Yeah, and then the MPs of the Conservative Party decided they wanted their person in the seat, so they persuaded.
That's not true. That sounds like a conspiracy theory. The MPs in the Conservative Party were cheering that budget to the rafters until it fell apart about their ears. It wasn't like a coup. It was an absolutely inevitable consequence of her epic failure.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you, James.
You can't. It's not an opinion. It's counting.
It's absolutely fundamentally correct. However, the reason Rishi Sunak was elected,
he wasn't elected.
Sorry, was chosen.
Yes,
was that the men in grey persuaded Penny Mordaunt not to stand, so that the MPs had the choice, as opposed to the members of the Conservative Party who would never have put Rishi in that job.
But do you think they'd have put Mordaunt in ahead of Sunak?
I think so.
They might have done. And well, then how did? I mean, I don't like the phrase "men in grey," but because most of this happened in plain sight. But why would she have agreed to that if she thought she was in with a really good chance of winning?
I think she agreed to that because the pressure of the party. Because even if she'd won, I'll not use the phrase, but even if she'd won, it would not have been. No, I
think you're misremembering. Didn't she fail to get the 100 nominations?
No, I don't think she did. I thought she got the 100 nominations.
I don't think she did.
I may be wrong. I thought she did. But even if she had won, the more seniors among the party would have.
Well, you can't have it both ways. If she didn't get the nominations, then your whole thesis falls apart. You can't say even if she had got the nominations, then the men in grey would still have done for her. But I think she got 90.
Oh, okay.
And you need
I stand corrected.
Oh, that's all right. No, I could be wrong. I'm googling furiously to double check and triple check, and I can't quite believe, such is her self-belief would be a nice way of putting it. I can't quite believe she would have taken her own hat out of the ring voluntarily. Ministrations of men in grey suits notwithstanding. But thank you, Ian. Great stuff. And there is something in that, actually. The problem is Brexit, as always, really. There's going to be a bit of Brexit, a little crumb, a bit of Brexit grit in any attempt to bring things back to sensibleness, because all the Brexit people, of course, are supposed to have a massive problem with unelected politicians or unelected bureaucrats. What's David Cameron? Well, he's an unelected politician, even. You know, I'm glad we got rid of all that in 2016, aren't you? 12:16 is the time.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
12:19 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we continue this interesting question, really, of why David Cameron. More interesting than perhaps we appreciated it. You got over the initial shock. Natasha Clark, our political editor, describing it as a 9 on the Richter scale of political journalists' shock levels, and inevitably this is what everybody is focusing on. That might be part of the calculation. This isn't me being self-aggrandizing. I'm always pretty open about when I'm being self-aggrandizing. I don't imagine there'll be many places in the media where people are pointing out just how close we came to a genuine catastrophe this weekend that Rishi Sunak would have been complicit in. Earlier callers suggesting, going further than my analysis, that Suella Braverman actively sought and incited, or sought to incite, some form of race riot, some form of attack by far-right thugs on the Palestinian march. I think that's what she wanted. Why else would she have framed it in the way that she did? And commentators calling for people to make a stand, the Daily Mail front page saying, pray there isn't a riot at the Cenotaph, creating in the minds of far-right thugs the idea that the Cenotaph would somehow be under threat. Completely bogus. But it doesn't matter. If they'd managed to breach the police lines and get to the protesters, then we could have seen something very, very horrible that I think Suella Braverman wanted to see. And if I can work this out from here, the idea that Rishi Sunak can't work it out from there is palpably ridiculous, which means he did work it out and didn't try to stop it because he didn't sack her until the plan failed. And maybe part of the reason behind the appointment of David Cameron is a little bit of Boris Johnson talking about painting buses. He has done something so extraordinary that everybody's talking about that instead of the stuff that just happened, which was Rishi Sunak's complicity in his Home Secretary's attempt to start a race riot on the streets of London. A plan foiled only by the independent mind of Sir Mark Rowley, Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. Could we have expected similar treatment, similar behaviour from Cressida Dick? I do not know. But it seems unlikely. So thank you once again to the police, not just the Met, but also the 1,000 officers who came in from elsewhere in the country. And thank you to the Commissioner, Mark Rowley, for refusing to become Suella Braverman's plaything. So maybe that's part of the Cameron appointment. We're all talking about that because it is so, quotes, interesting, end quotes, instead of talking about just how low we were brought on Saturday by Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman. If you were Rishi Sunak, what would you rather people talked about? The reality of what happened on Saturday or the appointment of David Cameron as Foreign Secretary? So there it is. Here we are, falling headlong into his trap. Rob's in Dorchester. Rob, what would you like to say?
Hello. First of all, can I say I'm an 80-year-old fan of yours.
That's fine.
It's the first time I've spoken to you. I'm an absolute avid anti-Brexiteer.
Yes.
And I have been listening to you ever since that
thank you, Rob.
complete idiot Johnson did his thing. Right.
Oh, thank you.
If you ask, I'm going to now come up with something a little bit maybe outrageous, which you may tear me apart.
Never.
If I was Rishi Sunak, noting that the huge majority of people who voted to leave have now changed their minds.
Yes.
If I wanted to get something to get people, I'm an ex-conservative, but I would never, ever vote again unless I thought there was some hope that they might try and rejoin the European Union or some form of the market. I told you you'd find this ridiculous.
Well, I
but
mean,
hang on.
I'm hanging, Rob.
If you were going to do that, if you were going to do a U-turn, and Rishi Sunak's he's not stupid. He knows that the one of the biggest reasons Conservatives have lost their popularity is because of Brexit. If there was a hint that he might be trying to get back in that direction, who better to have as Foreign Secretary than David Cameron? That's my argument, and I know you'll probably pull it to pieces, but it's just a thought.
I'm going to pull it to pieces. But I mean, it would involve the Tory party in its current form exploding.
Yep, but it would mean, just like Boris got elected on a lie, if this was true and he was going to try and get back in, it wouldn't be a lie, and the majority of the British people would like that.
Well, I don't know that that's true. I think you're conflating, if I may, the number of people who think Brexit has gone very badly with the people who knew or have now come to the conclusion that it was a very bad idea even to try it. There is a very large constituency of people who remain persuaded that there is a brilliant Brexit out there somewhere, but it just goes to a different school, Rob. They're not yet ready to admit failure and press reverse.
But there's not a majority. I mean, all the people...
No,
well,
that's true.
I'm standing in a field in the middle of deepest Dorset with my dog. But I spent 35 years in the military, a lot of which time I spent in Whitehall.
Okay.
And, you know, the civil service, I am quite sure, remain, although they're completely independent, of course, remain. I mean, anyone who actually thinks about Brexit and thinks seriously about it now realises it's a complete disaster.
How dare you?
This was predicted. I mean, it was predicted.
It's just, I always chuckle when I hear someone like you say it with such incredulity that it even needs saying. And yet I spend a lot of my time still butting heads with people who insist that it's either A, Rob, that it's going brilliantly, or B, that it's all your fault or my fault, that it's all gone badly. So just to hear, it's very refreshing to me to hear somebody just call a spade, frankly, when it comes to Brexit.
Well, it is. I was very during the lead up to the referendum. My MP was Oliver Letwin, and I used to go to his He'd have meetings, and when people asked questions, he'd always say, "Oh, well, it's up to the electorate." And I would stand up and say, to be quite honest, and I'm not. The electorate aren't competent to make this decision, and that's not because they're stupid or anything, but they're not competent. The way the decision should be made is like we did in the MOD in London. You look at all the options and come up with the best one. And so, really, it is completely and utterly absurd. And I think most thinking people... Sorry, I mustn't say that because it makes me sound...
No, I know, informed.
But...
Even that's a bit common.
I think that a huge number of people that have left the Conservative Party because of Brexit would come back. And he doesn't have to do this, but he may. If you were going to do it, it's just...
No, I like it. I mean, I like it as an analysis. And then, Sunak has created a vacuum where the reasons for appointing David Cameron would ordinarily be fairly obvious. And into that vacuum, anything can move. But I don't want you to get unduly optimistic or hopeful, Rob.
Well, we'll see.
We will see.
Who would you choose if you were going to have to get someone to negotiate your way back in? You couldn't choose any existing Conservatives. But Cameron, he's desperate.
Well, he is. You mean you certainly remind us of one thing that has been overlooked so far, and that is that the relations with the European Union are very much part of the Foreign Secretary's brief and not part of the brief one imagines that Suella Braverman spent a large amount of time ever looking at. So there could be... I think that anyone hearing the word rejoin and feeling a sort of swell of optimism in their breast is being poorly served at the moment. I don't think there's any prospect of it anytime soon. But I mean, a lot of the other stuff you said has certainly given me pause for thought. And you're right. If you were going to soften the approach, who better to do it than someone who would probably still be thought of quite warmly in Brussels, even, perhaps. I'm not sure. And thank you, Rob. And I look forward to your next call. That was hugely enjoyable. And I love the idea of adopting the Ministry of Defence approach to things and just doing the thing that's obviously not stupid when given a selection of options. God, those were the days. 28 after 12. Josh is in Chiswick. Josh, what would you like to say?
Hi there, James. Well, hopefully the line won't cut off like we did the last time we spoke. We were talking about atheism, and I think divine intervention...
Yeah, probably. You've got to watch that. You've got to be careful. You don't want to annoy him. Go on.
No, exactly. So I think with Cameron, I wonder if it's... And firstly, I want to caveat this by saying, again, I think he's one of the worst prime ministers we've ever had. Austerity was a political choice. It was horrendous. It did terrible damage to this country. And Brexit, of course. But within that... I think he might have been brought back, one, because he's a bit of a grown-up. I mean, not that he was ever really qualified, but he does have experience.
No, that's true.
Two, I think that it's an attempt possibly to detoxify the brand. Because Cameron, for all his faults and being all style and no substance, he was a PR man, and that's what he kind of did. I mean, I would never vote Tory. I'm very much on the left.
No, but he did. He got rid of the nasty party label, didn't he? I mean, probably wrongly or bogusly, but successfully.
Yeah. But he left even me thinking, as much as I disagreed with him politically, that he wasn't racist or homophobic, and I don't think he was. And that's a very low bar, right? But
not publicly or performatively racist or homophobic. Definitely not homophobic, because I think actually, if our friend in earlier had said equal marriage, I think counts as a policy win for David Cameron, doesn't it?
It does, and that's actually what I was going to say, and to be fair, that was actually a relatively brave move of his, because I imagine
given some of the people in his party at the time.
Yeah. And the other good thing he did was he extended I work in the film and television, and he extended the tax breaks, which I think came in under Labour, to film and TV production in this country, which did result in
attract some business. I mean, you think about Rob's idea as well, coupled with your idea, it's looking like an outwardly relatively sensible appointment. The problem would be, to whom does it appeal? That's the point. I mean, who are the people sitting there thinking, do you know what, that's actually, good. I'm going to look at the Tories a little bit more warmly than I was doing yesterday. I don't know if if that journey back into the fold is short enough for people to make it as a consequence of David Cameron's resurrection. Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
12:34 is the time. I think it's probably to do with calling time on the culture wars. Not my analysis. Someone else came up with that earlier. A couple of callers circling the same territory, actually. You get rid of Braverman and bring in David Cameron. I mean, David Cameron, hug a hoodie, equal marriage, detoxified the brand, as it were, from the time when Theresa May referred to it as the nasty party, although for all the rehabilitation of her reputation, Theresa May did rather a good job of turning it back into the nasty party when she was at the Home Office, of course. But, you put 30p Lee in as deputy chairman of the party, a man sort of best known for thuggish interventions on issues like poverty. And, of course, no, that's not fair. He's also known for trying to get a mate of his to pretend not to know him when he was door-knocking in what would become his constituency. Unfortunately, he still had his microphone on, and Michael Crick recorded him saying, "Pretend you don't know me. Pretend you don't know me, pal." That's a big pivot, isn't it, from promoting 30p Leenock to bringing David Cameron back into cabinet. I wonder if this is the end of this iteration of the Tory party's attempt to conjure culture wars out of thin air and turn us all against each other. But remember, it could have worked on Saturday. It could have worked. A lot of people, I just glanced at Twitter and saw Danny Dyer was trending. A lot of people asking me what Danny Dyer will make of this. You know, the David Cameron chapter in my book, all the chapters in my new book begin with a quote. And it's usually quite a hefty quote. The quote at the very beginning of the book is by Noam Chomsky. There are other quotes, a former employee of Rupert Murdoch's at the front of the Rupert Murdoch chapter. But when I came to the David Cameron chapter, there was really only one contender for the quote that best encapsulates his political legacy.
Going back to this whole Brexit thing, when you're judging them on Brexit, they don't know nothing about it. Who knows about Brexit?
Yeah, quite.
No one's got a clue what Brexit is, yeah? You watch Question Time, it's comedy.
Were you no clearer when Jeremy Corbyn explained
No, I got
Labour's
the clue.
policy?
No one knows what it is. It's like this mad riddle that no one knows what it is, right? So what's happened to that David Cameron who called it on? Let's be fair.
Oh.
I think you're referring to our former Prime Minister.
Yeah, but how comes he can scuttle off? He called all this on.
Yeah.
Yeah?
He has no regrets.
Where is he? He's in Europe, in Nice, with his trotters up. Yeah? Where is the geezer? I think he should be held accountable for it. He should be held accountable for it.
It's a valid point. A lot of people do feel that
I forget. I think that was an election night gathering, was it? If I'd known Danny Dyer, I might start saying yes to these things when they invite me on, just in case I end up sitting next to Danny Dyer. But and the strength of his language and the strength of his accent makes you think that he's providing comedy value. His analysis was absolutely on the money. That's the point. They were all sitting around nodding and stroking their chins, and Danny Dyer wades in, tells the truth about Brexit. It was almost impossible to find anybody telling the truth about Brexit on national television, even then, in 2019, would it be? Or 2017, perhaps? 2018, it wasn't an election then. It's literally just telling the truth about it. Everyone else is sitting around going, well, we haven't had time to try it. It's the will of the people. He voted for it as well, by the way, because he believed all the nonsense that people were being spoon-fed. And then he just sits there and goes, nobody, it's a riddle. It's a load of old rubbish. And where's that? Beep! David Cameron. I loved that. I thought that was proper politics for me. Passion and patriotism in the proper sense of the word, as in concern for what's happened for the country and outrage that the people responsible for it get to waltz off into the sunset. In David Cameron's case, he just sits in his shepherd's hut for 7 years and then comes back as Foreign Secretary. But why has Sunak done it? Mark's in Edgware. Mark, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hi, and thanks for putting Danny Dyer right in my ear down the phone for 60 seconds just now.
Very welcome.
Yeah, that was... Yeah.
Inject it into my veins, you said to yourself.
Yes, exactly. And I'm sorry if the couple of points I'm going to raise have been sort of touched on.
Don't worry, it's all good.
But my view, looking at this from Sunak's position and trying to put myself in his head, over this. It seems to me there's a really just a couple of things that guided him on this, and I don't think it was anything to do with culture wars. I think on the first point, he really is trying, by appointing Cameron, to distance himself from and to some extent marginalise the virulent right wing of the Conservative Party. He's trying to separate that wing of the party from a future election. I think that's true. And I think he chose Cameron specifically for the reason
But that is the culture war, actually. Maybe it's an unhelpful phrase, but what you're describing, the people who are sort of ramping up fears of immigration or fears of multiculturalism or fears of this or fears of the other, literally the other, of course, in this case, that he's moving away from that by appointing David Cameron means he's moving away from culture war style politics.
Yeah, but I think in the sense that if he's accused of taking the party down the culture, well, he can point to Cameron and say, no, we're not, because I think Cameron has two qualities. One, he was Prime Minister for, 5 years, and you learn as Prime Minister. It's inevitable.
You must learn something, mustn't you? With the exception of Johnson, yeah.
Well, I think you learn about foreign policy, particularly, because that's mostly where Prime Ministers seek to have their legacy sit. And his was, I think, his idea was to have the Brexit idea defeated in 2015, and that would be his legacy. He would have said, I settled the question, we stayed in, it was the right thing, and I shall be known for that. I think that was his plan. But the other thing I think that Sunak wants from him particularly is someone in cabinet who can act as a kind of mentor, someone who he can take to one side and say, look, how do I deal with this? And get advice that isn't based on a right-wing ideology. Now, the other reason why I think he appointed someone from outside of cabinet, outside of
the parliamentary party,
is because the absolute and complete dearth of talent within the parliamentary Conservative Party. There is nobody who hasn't already held office who is in any way fit to take on the role of Foreign Secretary.
That's an extraordinary allegation.
I think it's absolutely valid.
I couldn't agree more.
I do not think there is a member of Parliament on the Conservative benches who hasn't already had a role in government who would be fit
we've already. I mean, look, what you're trying to do is suggest that Suella Braverman, somehow there'll be somebody slightly less qualified than her, but still suitable for the job. I mean, my God, we've asked several times already this morning, what happens when you've scraped the bottom of the barrel and there's no barrel left? What are insects? Soil? Grit?
There's an article in The Guardian this morning by Simon Jenkins, and his comment is, if you see David Cameron as the solution to your problems, then things are a lot worse than you think. And I agree with that. But I do think Cameron may appeal to people in the centre who kind of think of themselves as instinctive conservatives, maybe not members of the party, but who are put off by the right wing of the party.
Yeah, but then where do the right wing go, you see? So, I mean, this is a very strong analysis until you remember that there are people out there who think who love Suella Braverman's race baiting.
Yeah, I agree, and I think they're a small group, but like all very vocal right or left-wing groups, when they're on the extreme, they tend to convince themselves that the people
they speak for the silent majority.
Or even not the silent majority. A lot of the time they claim that they hear this stuff from constituents or members of the public all the time. My view, I think my prediction of that is that they will become more extreme in their pronouncements, but that they will fail to recognise that they are in fact alienating what in this country is a fairly centrist.
Yeah, although the centrists have probably been the most poorly served part of the population for much of the last 7 or 8 years, certainly up until the 2019 election. Mark, what a sparkling analysis. I'm very grateful to you. I just to add one thing that hadn't occurred to me before, but it's just been pointed out. All 4 of the top offices of state are now held by privately educated men. So, the good old days are back. It's coming up to 1:45. That was a joke. It's coming up to 1:45. The mystery of David Cameron's appointment continues. And all of the answers we've received today have been good. I don't think there have been any that were... proper answers, rather than the idea that he's a brilliant politician who's going to bring all sorts of success into Downing Street. I think the biggest one is the detoxification. But then you've got, I forget what they're called. There's 2 parties. One is run by the fella out of Lewis who wasn't Lewis, and the other is run by Nigel Farage's former butler. And I can't remember whether one's called Reclaim and one's called Reform. But the one that is electorally viable is the one run by Nigel Farage's former butler. And he might benefit from this, because if Cameron is seen as... But that's great news for Labour. That's only good news for Labour. Where do the racist Tories go, really? The UKIP-y ones. The gammon, if you like. Where do they go? If Sunak's appointment of Cameron is a sort of attempt to tack back to the centre, where do the gammon go? 12:45 is the time.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
12:49 is the time. You've got to enjoy social media for mischief. Someone's just pointed out David Cameron is Britain's first Remainer Foreign Secretary since Liz Truss. It's funny because it's true. A remarkable business. Another, I'm looking forward to Boris Johnson being made Chief Justice of the UK Supreme Court and Liz Truss made Head of the Bank of England. I suppose all bets are off. And a very funny comedian whose work you should definitely consult, Matt Green, says, to be fair, David Cameron's return gives hope to everyone, asterisk, that it doesn't matter how badly you screw up in a job. If you wait around long enough, you can always have a second chance. Liz Truss is presumably watching with interest, and the asterisk refers to everyone in the Tory party, that is. But that's been true for ages. Remember when Owen Paterson got caught lobbying on behalf of people who were paying him in direct and egregious breach of parliamentary standards? The response of Boris Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg and others was to try to set fire to the rule book rather than watch their friend get punished. Speaking of friends, Therese Coffey is out as Environment Secretary. She is talking about resigning. I don't know. Natasha Clark will be joining Sheila Fogarty very shortly to go over some of the other developments that have unfolded while we have been on air. But goodness me, what an interesting morning it has been. Claire is in Wakefield. Claire, why has he done it? What do you think is going on here?
I don't know.
I like your honesty, Claire.
I don't. My main point is, it might have been discussed, but I haven't heard anyone talking about... Isn't it ridiculous and outrageous that someone who isn't even an elected MP the Prime Minister can just make them appear and shoot them into
a massive job like Foreign Secretary? Well, it happened. I mean, this is not necessarily a defence of the practice, but it was very popular in the 19th century, don't you know?
No, I'm not that much of an expert. The whole system is supposed to be. It doesn't seem very democratic. Well,
who cares whether David Cameron was elected or not on this occasion? What difference does it make to anything?
Well, why?
I don't know.
Why have an electoral system? Why have the House of?
Well, because the bloke making the appointments needs to achieve at least his seat in the House of Commons as a consequence of democracy, of the democratic exercise, doesn't he? I mean, so the bloke making the appointments, I mean, in a way, an earlier caller took precisely the opposite position to you, and I saw quite a lot of sense in what he said. Imagine if you were an absolute genius, you were the most gifted. Look at the woman they put in charge of the vaccine task force, Claire. Mm-hmm. Do you remember? Kate Bingham, her name was. Yeah. And by all accounts, she played an absolute blinder. It was probably the only thing Boris Johnson did as Prime Minister that we can chalk up as an unalloyed win. And no one really cared that she'd never been elected.
Okay, so maybe people who are needing votes they might have something else to offer.
Or even just someone's going to be very good at the job and it doesn't really matter that much whether they're a member... Well, he is now a member of Parliament again because he's going to put him in the House of Lords, but it doesn't matter whether they're a member of the House of Commons or not. Why do you think Sunak's done it? I know you said you don't know, but I'm going to insist that you at least try to form an answer.
Well, probably just because it looks like it's just going to tone down the far right and of the Tory party. But then these people do have a lot of support as well.
They do, but then where do they go? Where does 30p Lennox go if there's no room for this kind of vile bile? I suppose he'll get a job on one of those new television channels if he hasn't already. Claire, thank you. Luke's in Southwark. Luke, what would you like to say?
Dr. Cameron, Dr. O'Brien, because everybody's saying Cameron, it's on my mind. Big fan.
Thank you.
Even told me a new word, unalloyed.
Unalloyed. Well, I better
unalloyed
check that it's real. Because I often...
No, it is. I looked it up.
Did you look it up?
That's good. Means pure. It means pure, as in, like, big fan.
Thank you. It's very kind.
So, why has he done it? So... the simple answer, I mean, this is, just my
go
view.
on. That's all I do. Fear of what?
Well, I mean, he's not going to be next PM, is he? So, do you know what the odds are saying in terms of the next PM? Who's going to be Conservative?
No.
It's Sue Brave.
It's who?
Suella Braverman has now jumped to the top. Just in the Conservative Party, Starmer's still leading it, but she's at the top now.
Sure?
In terms of, I mean, check it yourself.
Kemi Badenoch's top, I think, 11-4. Suella Braverman and Penny Mordaunt are both on 5s.
But then I stand corrected, sir.
No, that's all right. I mean, it's not a gotcha. I don't know. Next permanent Conservative leader.
I know. Listen, like I
10
said,
to 3, 4 to 1.
But I did want to ask one thing though, because about an hour
I'm not
ago,
doing requests. I'm not doing requests today, Luke. But go on.
No. You said. I just wanted to understand. You said. We're talking about Sue Brave here.
Yeah.
She wanted a race riot.
Yes.
She wanted to see serious violence between far right thugs and publishers.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, because it would vindicate her. So it would not only prove that she was right to attack the police, but it would also prove that they were hate marchers. And that would make her right, which would strengthen her position and give her a green light to introduce even more repressive policies about peaceful protest.
Strengthen her political career?
Pardon?
It would strengthen her political career?
It would strengthen her position as Home Secretary immeasurably, because she could turn around and say, everyone told me I was wrong, but look, I was right. They are hate marchers and the police did let us down.
No. Hate marchers, they're there anyway, like whether they're on the right or
no,
not.
But the people on the
Palestinian
Palestinian march, the peaceful people there, she hoped would cease to be peaceful when they came under attack from far-right thugs, and therefore there would be a conflagration on the streets of London and there would be epic amounts of violence, and that would then empower her to say, you see, I was right about them and I was right about the police. So when Rishi Sunak came out and said, if there's any trouble this weekend, I will hold Mark Rowley responsible, he was crossing his fingers behind his back that there would be trouble on the streets of London and that he could then give Mark Rowley a coating. But the overwhelming majority of people marching in solidarity with Palestinian civilians were peaceful. And the desperate attempts by little Tommy Ten Names and his knuckle-dragging chums to infiltrate their march or attack their number failed, thanks in part to the paucity of numbers, to the pitiful number of people that turned up, that answered Suella Braverman's call and the Daily Mail's call and other commentators, and thanks largely to the efforts of the police, the Metropolitan Police in command, but 1,000 other officers from up and down these islands who also came to the protection of civilization and peace on Saturday. That's all. Thank you, Luke. 12:57 is the time. Last word on this to Tony in Greenock. David Cameron is a pie. What's he doing back as Foreign Secretary?
His votes, pure and simple.
Whose votes? Whose votes, Tony?
The centre right of those people who have gone to Labour because the Tories have gone too far to the right.
Yeah.
Cameron might be seen as somebody who can appease that.
So the ones who are like, I really don't want to vote for Keir Starmer, but I think I'm going to have to. He's given them a bit of pause today.
Yeah, I voted for Cameron before.
Yeah.
He seemed like a nice guy, irrespective of all the litany of things you've been going through. I think it's that Project Veer Right has not worked. There's not enough votes in it for him. I don't think. It's a busted flush in my view.
Yeah, mine too.
The Tories are a busted flush. I think the bigger problem they've got is a fight for the soul of their party going forward, and how that looks in the next 10, 20 years.
And I'm not sure Rishi Sunak's that invested in a fight for the soul of the Tory party. I think he'll be back in California hanging out with the tech broskies.
I have my own views on Rishi Sunak that I could probably best put into a book. It's worked for you, so I might
recommend
write a book on
it. I can recommend it heartily, Tony. Very good for the soul, right. and it's even in part for the bank balance. Thank you, mate. Mind how you go. 12:58 is the time. The attempted detoxification of the Tory party, the end of the culture wars. Those are the key answers to the question of why Rishi Sunak has brought back David Cameron. That and the absolute absence of suitable candidates for high office. But that, of course, didn't stop Boris Johnson putting Nadine Dorries and Jacob Rees-Mogg in the cabinet, or Rishi Sunak rehiring Suella Braverman a few days after she'd been fired by Liz Truss for breaching national security. So that's something else Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss have got in common. They've both fired Suella Braverman. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back to the whole show podcast on Global Player, where you can also pause and even rewind live radio. You'll also find all of LBC's shows to catch up on, as well as stay up to date with the latest news from LBC. So pause and rewind live radio on Global Player, where you're always in control. Download for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick, but now it's time for Sheila Fogarty.
Thank you, James.
James O'Brien on LBC.